What if I told you? 10 cruise ships vanished without a single distress signal. No wreckage, no bodies, no trace. These aren't rumors. These are eyewitness accounts from survivors who experienced the impossible. One passenger reappeared 13 years later, exactly as they were. Another crew member claimed the ship's systems were deliberately shut down. Maritime authorities refused to comment. But tonight, we're breaking the silence. Where were you when these ships disappeared? Drop your location and time zone in the comments and subscribe to Mr. Nightveil. The truth is darker than you think. I was asleep in cabin 847 when the lights went out. Not dimmed, out. Complete darkness. The kind that makes you question if your eyes are even open. My wife was still sleeping beside me, and I remember thinking the generator must have kicked in any second. It always does on these ships. But it didn't. What came instead was something I still can't explain to anyone without sounding insane. The radio mounted above our bathroom sink started crackling. At first, it was just static. The familiar white noise you'd expect from a dead frequency. But then, the voices came through. Distorted, layered. Like someone had recorded dozens of conversations and compressed them into a single transmission. I listened for the crew's call sign, the standard maritime protocol that should have been there. Nothing. These were voices I'd never heard before. They weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language I recognized. My wife woke up confused, and I told her to stay calm. I told her it was probably just a technical glitch. I was lying. I got out of bed and tried the light switch. Nothing. I tried the bedside lamp. Dead. The emergency panel on the wall, the one that's supposed to glow in the dark, was completely black. That's when the fear really started setting in. Not the panic kind. The kind that creeps up your spine slowly, methodically, like something was watching us figure out that we were trapped. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone. No signal. Of course, no signal. We were in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but the ship had Wi-Fi, satellite phones, emergency communication systems. All of it should have worked. None of it did. My wife grabbed my arm. "What's happening?" she whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know. I couldn't explain what I was feeling, this overwhelming sense that something fundamental had changed. Not just the power, something deeper, something wrong with the air itself. Like the oxygen had been replaced with something else that looked and felt identical, but carried a different weight. I opened the cabin door. It unlocked, at least that worked, and stepped into the corridor. The hallway was pitch black too, but my eyes were adjusting. There was a faint glow coming from somewhere deeper in the ship. Not from the emergency lighting. Something else. Something that looked almost organic, like bioluminescence. I'd never seen anything like it on a cruise ship before. The corridor seemed to stretch further than I remembered. When we'd boarded, the cabin assignments had felt straightforward. Room 847 was supposed to be on the starboard side of Deck C, 30 feet from the main atrium. But now, staring into that darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hallway was longer, wider. The angles didn't feel right. It was like the ship's internal geometry had shifted while we were sleeping. I moved toward the glow anyway, leaving my wife in the cabin with instructions to lock the door and not open it for anyone except me. That's when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, echoing from multiple directions at once. Not just from ahead of me, but from above, below, and behind simultaneously. Crew members. I recognized their uniforms from the glow of that strange light as they emerged from the darkness. But they weren't moving like crew members. Their movements were jerky, uncoordinated, like someone had filmed the motions of walking and running separately and then layered them on top of each other. One of them turned toward me. His face was blank, completely vacant, like someone had erased the person who used to live behind his eyes. His name tag read Riley, and I'd actually spoken to him earlier that day at the captain's cocktail hour. He was from New Zealand, had been working for the cruise line for 7 years, told jokes about dolphins. This thing wearing Riley's face didn't recognize me at all. I asked it what was happening. I asked what was wrong with the power. I asked if there was an emergency. It didn't respond. Its mouth opened slowly, and that same distorted radio transmission came pouring out. Not from the radio in my cabin, but directly from its throat. The same foreign voices, the same incomprehensible language. But now, hearing it from a human mouth, I could detect something underneath the distortion. A pattern, almost musical, almost like mathematics translated into sound. I backed away slowly, trying not to make sudden movements. The thing that used to be Riley tilted its head, studying me like I was an equation it was trying to solve. I ran. I don't remember making the decision to run. But suddenly I was moving, my bare feet slapping against the carpet, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind me, I could hear more of them emerging from the darkness. More crew members, more voices speaking in that impossible language. I turned a corner and found myself in a section of the ship I'd never seen before. The walls were different here, not the polished wood paneling from the main corridors, but something smoother, colder, almost metallic. The glow was brighter here, emanating from fixtures in the ceiling that looked nothing like standard maritime lighting. They pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. When I finally returned to the cabin, my wife was gone. Not like she'd left on her own. The bed was still, warm. Her reading glasses were on the nightstand. Her book, she'd been reading a mystery thriller, was still open to page 147, right where she'd fallen asleep. But she wasn't there. I called her name. Nothing. I searched the cabin frantically, checked the bathroom, the closets, even the tiny balcony. Empty. I ran back into the corridor to find the creature wearing Riley's face. He was gone too. The hallway was empty now, but I could still hear the voices coming from the walls themselves. The radio transmission had stopped, but the voices continued, layered, overlapping, like a crowd speaking in that same foreign language, getting closer with each passing second. By morning, or what I think was morning because the darkness never actually lifted, though the glow from the fixtures seemed to intensify, I found other passengers in the corridors. About 200 of us, wandering in groups, all looking confused and terrified. I asked people where they'd been before waking up in the hallways. No one could remember clearly. One woman named Sophia said she'd been in the dining hall for dinner. But it was the middle of the night when we all woke up in the corridors. Another man, David, insisted he was in a section of the ship that didn't exist on the deck plans we'd reviewed during the safety briefing. A section that was wider, taller, with ceilings that seemed to go up forever. Different architecture. Impossible geometry. When I asked him to describe it more, he started shaking and refused to speak further. A group of us tried to find the crew. We needed answers. We needed someone in authority to explain what was happening. Instead, we found more of them wandering the corridors, moving with that same jerky, uncoordinated motion. Some were still wearing their uniforms. Others had changed into passenger clothes, like they were trying to blend in. One of them, a woman named Catherine who'd served us breakfast, approached us with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She asked us if we were enjoying our cruise. asked if we needed anything. Her voice sounded normal, but underneath it, I could still hear that foreign transmission, like two frequencies playing simultaneously, one masking the other. I recognized her. She was real. I'd seen her every morning at the buffet line, pouring orange juice, asking people how they'd slept. Now she was something else entirely. The engines never stopped running. That's what haunted me most. Throughout everything, through the darkness, through the creatures acting like puppets, through the disappearances, the ship kept moving. We could feel the vibration beneath our feet. The constant, rhythmic thrumming that meant we were still cutting through the ocean at full speed. But toward where? We were lost. Completely lost. We tried to access the bridge, tried to find the navigation systems, tried to figure out our location. Every door was either locked or opened onto corridors we'd already explored. Some of them opened onto spaces that shouldn't have existed. One door opened onto what looked like a massive chamber, easily the size of an aircraft hangar, with walls covered in that same smooth, cold material. The glow was almost blinding in there. A man named Thomas tried to venture inside. When he returned, he couldn't speak. He just kept making that same sound, that foreign language transmission, over and over, until security found him and took him somewhere we couldn't follow. We finally found a working radio in the communications room. It took us hours to get the door open, but when we did, we found the captain's log. The handwriting started normal. Professional. All systems nominal. Passengers settling for the night. Course maintained. First Officer Hayes reports all crew stations operational. But then it deteriorated page by page. The letters became jagged, almost frantic. They're here. I can feel them. They've been here the whole time. In the spaces between. Waiting. The voices told me what they want. They want to understand us. They want to learn. They want to. And then it stopped. Mid-sentence. Like he'd just put the pen down and walked away. Or like something had walked away with him. We never found the captain. We never found my wife. We never found any explanation for where those 200 passengers had been before we woke up in the hallways. When the rescue ships finally arrived 3 days later, or what felt like 3 days, time had become unreliable by then. The crew seemed confused about why we were panicking. A captain named Richardson led the rescue operation. He said we'd been accounted for the whole time. He said the ship's systems had never gone offline. He said there was no power outage. He said the bridge was fully operational. He said our captain was resting and would see us soon. But when I looked into Richardson's eyes, I saw something flicker. Recognition. Fear. Like he knew exactly what had happened here, and he was terrified of what it meant. But I know what I experienced. I know my wife was there. I know those voices were real. I know that whatever was running that ship, it wasn't human anymore. It wasn't Riley. It wasn't Catherine. It wasn't the captain or First Officer Hayes. It was something that had learned to wear their shapes well enough to fool most people. But not me. I saw through the mask, just for a moment. And when I looked into the captain's quarters before the rescue arrived, I found my wife's reading glasses sitting on the captain's desk. Next to a log entry written in handwriting I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. The integration is almost complete. Soon we will all speak with one voice. Soon Riley, Catherine, Thomas, and the others will join us. Soon even the one in cabin 847 will understand. That was 2 years ago. I still don't know what she meant, and I still don't know why, sometimes, I hear that same foreign language playing underneath the static on my radio at home. My sister Olivia was a dancer on the Sapphire Crown. Not the kind of dancer you might be thinking. She was classically trained, performed in the evening shows, did the choreography for the ship's entertainment team. She loved that job. She loved the travel, the applause, the feeling that she was part of something glamorous and exciting. I was 23 when she disappeared. She was 28. That was 37 years ago, and I still can't talk about it without my hands shaking. The official report said the Sapphire Crown sank in a storm. The National Weather Service had recorded a Category 3 hurricane in the Atlantic that week. That's what they told us. That's what was in every newspaper. That's what the shipping company's lawyers kept repeating during the settlement negotiations. A storm. Unpredictable. Tragic. Act of God. No one's fault. Here's some money. Please stop asking questions. But I had the weather reports. I spent months after Olivia's disappearance going through Maritime archives, calling the Weather Service directly, requesting official documentation. The reports showed no Category 3 hurricane that week. There was a tropical depression 300 miles north of the Sapphire Crown's last known coordinates. Not even close. Not even severe enough to warrant an emergency alert. The seas were rough, yes, but nothing a ship that size couldn't handle. I had photocopies of these reports. I still have them. 37 years later, they're sitting in a folder in my office, the pages yellowed and fragile from being read so many times. So why did they lie? The shipping company's official logs were heavily redacted when they were finally released to the families. Black marker through entire pages, entire sections missing. I hired a lawyer, spent money I didn't have, to request unredacted documents under maritime law. The response came back with a legal notice. The information was classified for reasons of national security. National security? For a cruise ship that sank in 1987? It made no sense. My lawyer told me to drop it. He said I was wasting my time and money. He said I should take the settlement and move on. But I couldn't move on. Not when things didn't add up. I found other families. There were more of them than I expected. People whose loved ones had been on the Sapphire Crown, people who'd received settlements, people who'd been pressured to sign non-disclosure agreements in exchange for the money. Some of them wanted to talk. Most of them wouldn't. They were afraid. They told me they'd been contacted by people from the shipping company, people from the government, people they couldn't quite identify. These visitors had made it clear that talking about what happened on the Sapphire Crown would have consequences. Legal consequences, financial consequences. They didn't elaborate. They didn't have to. One woman named Emma, whose husband had been a steward on the ship, agreed to meet me in a coffee shop. She was nervous, kept looking over her shoulder, kept asking me to speak quietly. She told me that her husband had written letters home during the voyage. Personal letters describing things that didn't match the official narrative. He wrote about strange activity in the lower decks. He wrote about crew members being restricted from certain areas. He wrote about unusual equipment being loaded onto the ship before departure. He wrote that he was being told not to ask questions. The letters stopped 3 days before the official sinking date. Emma had kept copies of those letters before she signed the NDA. She gave them to me, but only on the condition that I never reveal her husband's name. I've kept that promise for 37 years. But what those letters described, it wasn't a sinking caused by weather. It was something else entirely. The handwriting in those letters was shaky, like he was writing in fear. One passage stood out to me. They're moving something in the lower decks, something that wasn't on the manifest, something that requires military-grade equipment. I don't know what it is, but I know we shouldn't be transporting it. And I know that if I ask too many questions, I'll disappear like the others who have. The shipping company, Maritime Corporation, was purchased by a larger conglomerate 6 months after the Sapphire Crown disappeared. Within a year, the sister ship, the Sapphire Dream, identical in design and configuration, was bought by the same conglomerate and immediately decommissioned. I watched the news reports. The ship was towed to a scrapyard in Bangladesh, dismantled piece by piece. I wondered what they were looking for, what they needed to remove so badly that they couldn't just leave the ship in service. I tried to contact people at the scrapyard. No one would speak to me. Records of what was salvaged from the Sapphire Dream disappeared from public archives. Then, in 1992, 5 years after the disappearance, I received a phone call from a man who identified himself only as Simon. He said he'd been a crew member on the Sapphire Crown. He said he'd been part of the recovery operation. He said he needed to talk to someone who wanted answers. We met at a bus station in Philadelphia. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked like he'd aged 20 years and 5. His hands trembled constantly. He couldn't maintain eye contact. But he talked. He talked for 3 hours. And what he told me changed everything. According to Simon, the Sapphire Crown had been transporting more than just tourists and performers. There were cargo containers in the hold that weren't listed on the manifest. Government cargo. He didn't know what was inside, but he knew it was important. Important enough that the crew had been divided into 2 groups. Those who knew about it and those who didn't. Olivia, being a performer, was part of the group that didn't know. She was just there to entertain the passengers. She was just doing her job. Simon said he'd seen her perform the night before everything went wrong. He said she was brilliant. He said she was alive and healthy and had no idea what was about to happen. But something happened to those cargo containers. Something went wrong. Simon was vague about the details, or perhaps he genuinely didn't know them. He kept saying things like, the readings were abnormal, and the temperature dropped in the hold, and we were told to evacuate the lower decks. He said that the captain made an emergency call to the Coast Guard, but the message was intercepted by someone else. He didn't know who. A military vessel appeared on the radar. Not a Coast Guard ship. Something else. Something military and official. The Sapphire Crown's transponder went offline. Communications ceased. And then, according to the official report, the ship sank. But Simon said the ship didn't sink. He said it was deliberately scuttled. He said the passengers and crew were evacuated, but not to safety. They were transferred to the military vessel. He said there were fewer people transferred than there were supposed to be. He said people were missing. He said Olivia was one of them. He said he watched her being separated from the other passengers. He said he tried to stop it, but armed personnel prevented him from interfering. He said that was the last time he saw her. I asked him how he knew that. He told me he'd seen a manifest. A real manifest, not the one that was released to the families. It had passenger names and crew names, and next to many of them were notations. Some said recovered. Some said transferred. Some said unaccounted for. Olivia's name was in the 3rd category. But there was something else written next to her name. A single letter followed by a series of numbers. Simon couldn't explain what it meant. He said it didn't match any standard maritime coding system he knew. After that conversation, Simon wouldn't answer my calls. I tried to find him. He'd disappeared. I hired a private investigator. The investigator told me he found no record of anyone named Simon with the description I provided ever working for Maritime Corporation. It was like he'd never existed. Except I had met him. I had spoken to him. I had his story. And I had something else. Simon had given me a photograph before he left. It showed him standing next to Olivia at a crew party 3 days before the ship disappeared. They were both smiling. They were both very much alive. Then I found the other photographs. Someone, I never found out who, sent me a package containing photographs taken at the Sapphire Crown's last port in San Juan. The photos showed the ship's upper decks during daytime hours. They showed absolutely no passengers, no crew, just empty deck chairs, empty pools, empty restaurants and bars. The photos were dated and time-stamped. They were taken during the daytime when the ship should have been full of people. But it wasn't. In one of the photographs, I could see the stage where Olivia performed. It was empty, unused, like no one had ever been there at all. I tried to trace where the photographs came from. The package had no return address. The postmark was smudged. I showed them to my lawyer. He went pale. He told me to destroy them. He said I didn't want to know where they came from. He said some things were bigger than finding the truth about one missing person, even if that person was my sister. He said people had died trying to expose what happened on the Sapphire Crown. He said my obsession with finding Olivia was going to get me killed. I didn't destroy them. I kept them in the same folder as the weather reports and the letters from Emma's husband and the photograph of Simon and Olivia together. Over the years, I've tried to find other people who were on that ship, other survivors who might be willing to talk. Most of them are dead now. The ones who are still alive won't speak to me. One woman, a passenger who survived, agreed to meet me once. She sat across from me in a restaurant and said only this: "Your sister is alive, but she's not the person you remember, and for your own safety, you need to stop looking for her. They're still watching. They're always watching. And if you keep asking questions, they'll come for you too." Then she got up and left. She left so quickly that she forgot her purse. When I opened it, I found a note written on the back of a receipt. The ship didn't sink. It was hidden. And the people on it, they weren't evacuated. They were collected. Tell no one. Destroy this note. Forget you ever met me. I've spent 37 years trying to piece together what happened on the Sapphire Crown. I've collected documents, interviewed survivors, talked to people who may or may not have actually worked for the shipping company. I've followed leads that dead-ended. I've read weather reports that contradict the official narrative. I've seen photographs that shouldn't exist. I've heard testimony from Simon, who may have been a ghost. I've received anonymous warnings and cryptic messages. I've watched as people who knew me disappeared from my life. Their social media accounts deleted. Their phone numbers disconnected. And what I've concluded is this: the Sapphire Crown didn't sink in a storm. The ship was deliberately destroyed, and the passengers and crew were either killed or transferred to somewhere I don't understand. Olivia was one of them. The government knew what happened. The shipping company knew. Emma knew but was afraid to speak. Simon tried to tell me, but vanished. The families were paid to stay silent. And somewhere in the classified files of maritime authorities and government agencies, there is a truth that I will probably never know. But I know my sister was there. I know something happened to her. I know Simon saw her taken away. I know Emma's husband tried to warn us. And I know that the official story is a lie. That's all I've got after 37 years. But it's enough to know that I'm not crazy. It's enough to know that my sister's disappearance wasn't an accident. And it's enough to know that someone, somewhere, is still hiding the truth about what really happened on the Sapphire Crown. And until I find that truth, I'll keep looking. No matter what they threaten me with. No matter how many people disappear around me. Because Olivia deserves to be remembered as more than just a victim of an official lie. I was the night shift engineer on the Star of Meridian. Third shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week for 18 months. That's where I spent most of my adult life. In the engine room, 3 decks below the waterline, surrounded by machinery that never sleeps. Engineers don't get a lot of attention. We're invisible to the passengers. We're just the people who keep the lights on and the engines running. But we see everything. We know when something's wrong before anyone else does. And on the night of March 15th, 2015, I saw something that I still haven't been able to process. My name is Ronan. I'm writing this down now because I don't think I have much time left. Not because anyone's threatened me directly, but because I've started noticing things. People following me. Phone calls that cut off the second I answer, the feeling that I'm being watched constantly. The Maritime authorities have made it clear that if I talk about what happened on the Star of Meridian, there will be consequences. They used those exact words, consequences. But I can't stay silent anymore. Someone needs to know what really happened that night. The Star of Meridian was a state-of-the-art vessel, built in 2010, equipped with the latest navigation and communication systems. Integrated Bridge System, IBS, which meant that every major function of the ship could be controlled from the bridge, or, in case of emergency, from auxiliary stations throughout the vessel. Redundancy built into every system, multiple backups, fail-safes designed to fail safe. It was considered one of the most technologically advanced cruise ships in operation. But redundancy only works if the systems are actually independent. That's what I learned that night. I was running diagnostics when I noticed the first anomaly. Nothing major, just a slight variance in the primary navigation system's response time. A delay of maybe 200 milliseconds. Barely noticeable. The kind of thing you might dismiss as a sensor fluctuation or normal system drift. But I've been working in engine rooms for 23 years. You develop an instinct for when something's off. So I ran the diagnostic again. Same result. Slight delay. I logged it in the maintenance system and continued my rounds. Then, at 1:47 a.m., I noticed something else. The backup communication system showed a partial power draw that shouldn't have been there. The backup comm system is isolated from the primary systems. It's supposed to be completely independent. Separate power supply, separate antenna array, separate data transmission protocols. There's no reason for it to draw power unless someone was actively using it. And no one should have been using it at that hour. I checked the logs. No record of any communication being sent or received. But the power draw was real. I could see it in the real-time monitoring system. I decided to go up to the bridge and talk to the captain. His name was Omar. Good man. Experienced. 15 years. Commanding cruise ships. He was in his ready room when I found him. I told him about the anomalies I'd detected. I kept it casual, just checking in, just wanted to make sure everything was normal. Omar listened, nodded, and then something shifted in his expression. He got very quiet. He asked me to describe the anomalies in detail. I did. When I finished, he told me to go back to the engine room and continue my shift. He said he'd look into it. That was the last normal conversation I had with Captain Omar. 40 minutes later, Chief Engineer Lane arrived at the engine room. This was unusual. Lane worked day shift. Night shift was supposed to be my domain. Night shift was supposed to be my domain. Lane should have been home sleeping. But there she was, dressed in full uniform, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She came directly to me and said, "Ronan, I need you to perform a full system recalibration on the primary navigation system. Start immediately. And don't log it in the maintenance system. This is a direct order from Captain Omar." I asked her why. She didn't answer. She just stared at me with this look in her eyes, desperation mixed with fear. I'd never seen Lane scared before. Lane was the kind of engineer who could fix anything, who never panicked, who treated every problem like it was just another Tuesday. But that night, she looked terrified. She repeated the order. "Don't log it. Full recalibration. Now." I started the recalibration sequence. It takes about 40 minutes to complete. During that time, Lane stood next to me, watching the monitoring systems, watching me. Not saying anything. Just watching. When the recalibration finished, she nodded and left without another word. I tried to call her back to ask what was going on, but she was already gone. The real problem started at 3:15 a.m. I was doing routine maintenance checks when I noticed that the backup systems were no longer responding to standard diagnostic queries. They should have given me a status report. Power levels, system integration, data transmission logs, all normal stuff. But instead, I got nothing. Complete silence. It was like the backup systems had been completely isolated from the main monitoring network. I ran the diagnostic again. Still nothing. That's when I realized that something more serious than a sensor glitch was happening. I went to the auxiliary control station, a backup command center located near the engine room that could manually override most ship systems in case of emergency. I pulled up the system status screen. What I saw made my blood go cold. The primary navigation and communication systems showed as functional on the status display. But underneath that, in the detailed logs that only appear if you dig deep into the system architecture, I could see something else. A secondary command chain. Someone had installed a parallel control system that could override the primary systems without triggering any alarms or notifications. And that parallel system was active. I realized immediately what this meant. Someone had the ability to control the Star of Meridian's navigation and communication systems without the captain knowing. Without anyone on the bridge knowing, the ship could be steered off course. Distress signals could be blocked. Everything could appear normal on the surface, while underneath, the ship was being controlled by someone else entirely. I called Lane on her personal line. She didn't answer. I tried calling the captain. Security told me the captain was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. I ran down to the bridge to find him myself. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was that Captain Omar was no longer there. Instead, there was someone else sitting in the captain's chair. Someone I'd never seen before. His name was Tristan, according to the uniform nameplate. He wore a captain's uniform, but something was off about him. His movements were stiff. His expression was blank, like he was reading from a script written on his face. I asked the first officer, a woman named Eleanor, where Captain Omar had gone. She looked at me like I'd just asked her to explain quantum physics. She said, "Captain Omar is resting. This is Captain Tristan. He's assumed command for the remainder of the voyage." I asked her when this happened. She said, "Just a few moments ago." Why? Is there a problem? There was definitely a problem. I went back down to the engine room and started checking the primary navigation system more carefully. That's when I discovered the foreign equipment. Integrated into the main navigation processor was a piece of hardware that should not have been there. High-grade military-spec circuitry, encrypted data transmission module. The kind of equipment you don't just pick up at a marine supply store. Someone had installed this during dry dock. Someone with serious resources and serious access to the ship's systems. I realized that the Star of Meridian hadn't just been modified. It had been compromised. And the compromise had happened before the voyage even started. I tried to access the communication logs to see if there were any messages being sent or received by this hidden system. Everything was encrypted. Military-grade encryption. The kind that requires biometric authentication and specialized decryption keys. I couldn't get in, but I could see that data was being transmitted. Constantly, out through the backup antenna, out to somewhere I couldn't identify. That's when I heard the announcement on the internal communication system. All crew members, please report to your assigned emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. But there was no emergency. The engines were running smoothly. The weather was calm. We were in the middle of open ocean with no other vessels nearby. There was no reason for an emergency announcement. I tried to contact Lane again. Still no answer. I tried to access the crew roster to see where she was, stationed. Her name wasn't on the emergency roster. It was like she disappeared from the official records. I made the decision to send a message. A real message, not a distress signal. I knew that would be intercepted by whatever control system had been installed. But the old backup communication system, the one they'd installed in 1995 before all the new integrated systems, was still physically connected to the main antenna. Nobody used it anymore, but the hardware was still there. I powered it up manually, bypassing all the encrypted circuits, and sent a single transmission on the Maritime emergency frequency. Star of Meridian. Systems compromised. Navigation under external control. Manual override impossible. Position coordinates. I gave my best estimate of our location. Crew acting under orders not from command structure. Possible hostile takeover. Please advise. I hit send. For exactly 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then, every single system in the engine room went dark. Completely. Backup power, emergency lighting, redundant systems. All of it went offline simultaneously. Someone had reached into the electrical grid and pulled the plug on everything. I was standing in absolute darkness. 3 decks below the waterline, surrounded by machinery that had just stopped running. The ship was dead. No power. No propulsion. No communication. Then the emergency lights came on. A single red glow illuminating the engine room like we'd entered hell itself. I heard footsteps. Heavy boots on the metal deck plating. Multiple people, moving with military precision. They came down the stairs without hesitation, without confusion, moving through the darkness like they knew exactly where to go. That's when I realized. They'd been waiting for me to do exactly what I did. They'd let me discover the hidden systems. They'd let me find the foreign equipment. They'd let me send that message. And now they were coming to collect me. I hid. I don't know why. It was a stupid instinct. There's nowhere to hide in an engine room. But I squeezed myself behind one of the massive diesel engines and waited. The men in the boots walked past me without seeing me. They moved to the auxiliary control station and disconnected something, physically ripped out a circuit board and put it in a bag. Then they disconnected the old backup communication system I'd used. They were removing evidence. Or maybe they were just making sure I couldn't do it again. They left. They walked back up the stairs and they left. When they were gone, I pulled out my personal phone and checked the time. 4:33 a.m. I'd been hiding for 8 minutes. The ship was still dead. No power, no lights except the emergency red glow. I had no idea what was happening on the bridge. Whether the captain was still in charge, whether Eleanor was still at her station, whether we were still moving or just drifting in the dark water. Then the main engines came back online. Gradually, power returned to the grid. Lights came up. The ship hummed back to life like nothing had happened. I heard the announcement again. All crew members return to normal stations. Emergency situation has been resolved. Resume normal operations. But it hadn't been resolved. I knew that. I'd sent a distress signal. Someone should be coming. The Coast Guard should be responding. Military vessels should be converging on our position. Someone should be doing something. Nothing happened. I worked the rest of my shift in a daze. When 7 a.m. came and the day shift engineer arrived, I told him everything. I told him about the anomalies, the hidden systems, the foreign equipment, the men in boots, the signal I'd sent. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Ronan, you need to delete all personal records of this conversation. You need to pretend this night never happened. And you need to understand that if you talk about this to anyone at all, your career at sea is over. Permanently, and possibly your freedom as well." He wasn't threatening me. He was warning me. Like he knew something I didn't. The Star of Meridian completed its voyage without incident. We pulled into port in Miami 3 days later. The passengers disembarked normally. The crew dispersed. Life went on. But when I checked my employment records, I found that I'd been reassigned. No longer night shift on the Star of Meridian. No longer working for Meridian Maritime Corporation at all. I'd been transferred to a different shipping company. The letter said it was a promotion. It came with a significant raise. It also came with a single paragraph that said, "You are forbidden from discussing your previous assignment with any third party, including maritime authorities, media, or law enforcement. Violation of this clause will result in immediate legal action and asset forfeiture." That was 10 years ago. I took the transfer. I took the raise. I took the silence. But I've never stopped thinking about that night. I've never stopped wondering who was really controlling that ship. I've never stopped wondering what would have happened if I hadn't sent that signal. I've never stopped wondering if Captain Omar is still alive, if Lane is still alive, if Eleanor is still working at sea, or if she's been disappeared like so many others who've asked the wrong questions. The Star of Meridian is still in operation, still carrying passengers, still cutting through the ocean at night while things happen in the darkness that nobody's supposed to know about. And somewhere, on some classified server in some government facility, there's a record of what happened that night. A record of who was controlling the ship. A record of why. A record that I'll never be allowed to see. But I know the truth. And that truth is that the ship didn't fail. It was never meant to fail. It was meant to be controlled. And I was meant to discover that. Whether to test my loyalty or my silence, I still don't know. But I know one thing for certain. I was the night shift engineer. I saw the readings nobody's supposed to see. And I've been paying for that knowledge ever since. We boarded the Artemis at noon on a Tuesday in July. I remember this detail specifically because I checked my watch as we walked up the gangway, 12:04 p.m. to be exact. Seiko dive watch, the kind that never loses more than a few seconds a year. I'd owned it for 15 years. It was the most reliable thing in my life. That's why what happened next still doesn't make sense to me. My name is Israel, and I'm still trying to understand what I experienced on that ship. My wife, Ashley, was with me. We'd saved for 3 years for this cruise. The Artemis was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. 7 days in the Mediterranean, ports in Greece and Italy. All the luxury and relaxation we'd been dreaming about. We were both 42 years old, celebrating our 20th wedding anniversary. We'd left our 2 children with Ashley's mother. We were supposed to come back rested and reconnected. Instead, we came back broken. The sun never set that first day. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you this knowing exactly how insane it sounds. But I'm going to describe what happened, and you're going to understand why I can't let this go. Ashley thinks I've lost my mind. My therapist thinks it was a shared psychotic episode brought on by stress and heat exposure. But I know what I experienced, and I know I'm not the only one. We got to our cabin around 1 p.m., standard inside cabin on deck 7, nothing fancy, but clean and comfortable. We unpacked, changed into lighter clothes, and decided to head to the pool area to get acclimated. Ashley wanted to swim. I wanted to relax and watch the coast of Spain disappear behind us. The ship was supposed to set sail at 2 p.m. By 1:45 p.m., we were up on the pool deck with our drinks and our sunscreen, ready to begin our vacation. The sun was directly overhead. Bright, intense, the kind of Mediterranean sun that makes you squint even with sunglasses on. I checked my watch. 1:52 p.m. The ship's horn sounded, 3 long blasts, and I felt the gentle vibration of the engine starting up. We were leaving port. The adventure was beginning. I fell asleep in my deck chair around 3 p.m. Ashley was reading beside me. When I woke up, the sun was still directly overhead. Still bright. Still intense. Still in the exact same position it had been when I'd fallen asleep. I checked my watch. 3:47 p.m. 47 minutes had passed. That made sense. Naps at sea tend to be brief because of the rocking motion and the activity around you. But when I looked at the sky, something felt wrong. The sun hadn't moved. Not at all. It was frozen in the sky like a painting, unchanging, permanent. I mentioned it to Ashley. She looked up from her book and laughed. She said, "The sun moves slower at sea, doesn't it?" It was meant to be a joke, but it revealed that she'd noticed something too. She was rationalizing it, trying to make it fit into a normal explanation. But she'd noticed. By 6 p.m., the sun still hadn't moved. Other passengers were starting to notice it too. I overheard a man asking a crew member where the sun was going. The crew member looked confused. He said the sun would set at its normal time. The man asked what time that was. The crew member paused. He seemed to be thinking very hard, like someone was asking him to do advanced mathematics. Then he said, "The sun sets when it sets." And then he walked away. That's when I realized that something fundamental was wrong. Ashley and I went to the buffet for dinner around 7 p.m. The dining room was full of passengers, all eating, all seeming relatively normal. But there was an underlying anxiety in the air. People kept glancing at the windows. The sun was still there, still directly overhead, still bright enough that we didn't need the cabin's artificial lighting. I asked a waiter if this was normal. He looked at me like I'd asked him if water was wet. He said, "What else would it do?" By 9 p.m., people were starting to panic. Not openly, not aggressively, but there was a tension building. Passengers were congregating in the halls, in the lounges, asking crew members questions. Where were we? What time was it? Why hadn't the sun set? Every crew member we encountered gave variations of the same answer. Confused silence, followed by a vague, almost scripted response. The sun is where it should be. Time is moving normally. Everything is fine. It was the way they said it that was terrifying. Like they were reciting lines they'd memorized but didn't understand. I went to the bridge to seek an officer. Someone in actual command who could explain what was happening. A woman named Riley, the second officer, was standing near the navigation station. I asked her what our current position was. She checked the GPS and told me coordinates that I later looked up on a map. We were supposed to be off the coast of Sardinia by now. According to the GPS, we were still in the harbor we'd left that morning. The ship hadn't moved. Or rather, the ship had moved. We could feel the engines. We could feel the motion of the waves. We could smell the salt air. But our position on the map hadn't changed. I asked Riley how that was possible. She looked at the GPS like she was seeing it for the first time in her life. She said, "That's very strange." Then she smiled. A smile that didn't reach her eyes. A smile that suggested she was playing a part and had suddenly forgotten her lines. She said, "I'm sure it will correct itself soon. These systems malfunction sometimes." When I asked her what time the sun would set, she paused for a very long time. Then she said, "You're the third group asking me this today." I felt my blood go cold. Third group. It was only 9 p.m. on our first night. How many groups of passengers could have posed this question in the 8 hours since we'd boarded? I went back to the cabin and tried to use the phone to call the Maritime authorities. The phone was dead. No dial tone, no error message. Just silence. I tried Ashley's cell phone. No signal. I tried the cabin television. Every channel showed the same image, a calm ocean with the sun directly overhead. A frozen, unchanging image, like a screensaver that would never wake up. Ashley was frightened now. She'd stopped trying to rationalize it. She sat on the edge of the bed and asked me what was happening. I didn't have an answer. I didn't have any explanation that wouldn't sound insane. I attempted to return to the bridge, but when I got to that corridor, it looked different. Not drastically different, but subtly off. The walls seemed slightly wider than I remembered. The length of the hallway seemed longer. When I reached what I thought was the entrance to the bridge, I discovered myself at the swimming pool instead. Except the pool was empty. Completely empty. No water. Just a dark, echoing pit with drain grates at the bottom. I ran back to the cabin. I took Ashley's hand, and we decided we needed to locate other passengers. Safety in numbers. Rational people who could help us figure out what was happening. We went to the main atrium. It was full of people, all of them with the same confused, anxious expression. A man was organizing people, trying to get a head count, trying to determine if anyone had actually witnessed the sunset since boarding. Nobody had. Everyone reported the same phenomenon. Time passing strangely, the sun never moving, the crew giving nonsensical answers. One woman mentioned that she'd seen photographs in her cabin. Old photographs. Decades old. Cruise photos from the 1970s, showing people enjoying the pool, enjoying the dining room, enjoying the exact same ship we were on. But the photos also showed the sun in the same position, directly overhead, never moving. The photos were dated 1974, 1975, 1976, all from July, all showing the same frozen sky. Another passenger said he'd encountered a personal item in one of the common areas. An old Polaroid camera with film inside. He developed the photos using chemicals he located in the ship's photo lab. All the photographs displayed passengers in different eras of clothing, some from the 1950s, some from the 1980s, some from the 2000s. But every single image showed the same view out the window, the same ocean, the same sun, the same position in the sky. I asked the man organizing the group if he remembered what day it was. He said Tuesday. I asked him what time he'd boarded. He said noon. I asked him what his watch said the current time was. He checked. His watch said 9:47 p.m. I looked at my watch. It said 9:47 p.m. I looked at Ashley's watch, 9:47 p.m. I looked at other passengers' watches and phones. Every single device that showed time was displaying 9:47 p.m. The time hadn't advanced in hours. The time was frozen. That's when Riley appeared in the atrium. She looked at all of us gathered there and said, "You need to return to your cabins. The ship runs smoothly when passengers are in their cabins." Her voice was different now. Not confused, not scripted. Completely flat. Completely emotionless. Like she was speaking through a voice box. Behind her, I could see crew members standing at various points around the atrium, watching, waiting. We didn't argue. We retreated to our cabins. Ashley and I sat in the darkness, listening to the engines running, feeling the ship move through the water, watching the frozen sun through the cabin window. Neither of us slept that night. We couldn't, because we both understood something that we couldn't verbalize. We weren't on a normal cruise ship anymore, if we ever had been. The next morning came when the cabin door automatically opened and crew members handed out breakfast trays. I checked my watch. 9:47 p.m. The same time. The sun was still overhead. Ashley refused to eat. I consumed the meal mechanically, trying to function, trying to stay rational even though rationality was dissolving around me. Over the following days, or what should have been days, time had become completely meaningless. I explored the ship more thoroughly. I encountered things that made no sense. A cabin on Deck 9 that didn't exist on any deck plan. A stairwell that descended 5 flights, but somehow placed me back on the same deck I'd started from. A swimming pool that sometimes contained water and sometimes didn't. Crew members who didn't respond to questions, but simply stood in corridors, watching passengers pass. I came across a lounge where old television broadcasts were playing on a loop. News programs from different decades. Weather reports showing the same date over and over, July 16th. A calendar on the wall showed July 16th in every month. July 16th, August 16th, September 16th, all dated as the present. I watched the same news broadcast from 1982, then from 1995, then from 2009, all reporting events that had supposedly happened on July 16th of those respective years. But the timestamp was identical. 9:47 p.m. Always 9:47 p.m. I stumbled upon a ship's manifest in the captain's ready room. The crew let me in without question. The manifest listed every passenger who'd ever traveled on the Artemis. Hundreds of names. Thousands of names. Names from different eras, different generations. All supposedly passengers on this ship. All supposedly departing from the same port on different dates that were somehow the same date. July 16th, repeated across decades. I noticed Ashley examining a photo album in our cabin one morning. It was a photo album that didn't belong to us. It contained pictures of our cabin, but from different eras. Photographs of us in that cabin. Photographs of people who resembled us in that cabin. Images from the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. All in the exact same cabin. All with the sun directly overhead in the window behind them. That's when I understood what was happening. We weren't just trapped on a ship. We were trapped in a moment. A single moment frozen in time. And we weren't the first. We weren't going to be the last. I tried to break the pattern. I refused to follow crew member orders. I stayed out of my cabin. I attempted to access areas of the ship that seemed off limits. But every time I did, I found myself back in a familiar place. The corridors looped. The stairwells led nowhere. The doors opened onto rooms I'd already visited. The ship itself was the prison, and time itself was the lock. After what felt like weeks, Though my watch still showed 9:47 p.m., rescue boats appeared. Not Coast Guard boats, not official rescue vessels, just small boats that pulled up to the ship at night. The crew gathered all the passengers on the lower decks. They told us we could leave. They told us rescue had arrived. They told us we'd be safe. We got into the boats. We were taken to a larger vessel. We were given dry clothes. We were given water. We were asked questions by people in unmarked uniforms. They interrogated us about our experience. They inquired what we remembered. They questioned whether we'd noticed anything unusual. I told them everything. Ashley refused to speak. They thanked us for our cooperation. They informed us we'd be returned to port. They assured us we'd receive compensation for the inconvenience. They made it very clear that we should not discuss our experience with anyone. Ever. Not to media. Not to maritime authorities. Not to family. Not to doctors. Not to anyone. We were returned to port 3 days later, or 3 hours later, or 3 years later. I don't know anymore. Time feels different now. My watch still works, but I don't trust it. Ashley doesn't speak anymore. Not about the ship. Not about anything, really. She just sits and watches the ocean. I retained one possession. The photo album from our cabin. The one with pictures of us from different eras, all in that same cabin, all with the same frozen sun in the window. I have no explanation for how those pictures exist. I have no explanation for any of it. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we actually made it off that ship. I wonder if I'm still there, still experiencing that moment, frozen at 9:47 p.m., and this reality, this life I'm living now, is just my mind's way of coping with an incomprehensible truth. I wonder if Ashley knows the answer. I wonder if that's why she doesn't speak anymore. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, I look at my watch. It's always a different time now. But there's a part of me that half expects it to stop at 9:47 p.m. forever. There's a part of me that never really left that ship. There's a part of me that's still there, watching the sun that will never set, waiting for time to move again. We received the distress signal at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning in March 1992. I was the senior rescue coordinator for Sector Atlantic, which meant I was the one who had to make the calls, send the teams, and file the reports. The signal came from the Providence, a mid-sized cruise vessel operating in international waters approximately 400 nautical miles off the coast of Massachusetts. The transmission was fragmented, corrupted, lasting only 12 seconds before cutting off entirely. No captain's name, no vessel status, just coordinates and then silence. My name is Zaire, and what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. I've spent 33 years in the Coast Guard. I've coordinated over 2,000 rescue operations. I've pulled people from burning ships, sinking vessels, disabled yachts in hurricane conditions. I've seen things that would break most people's minds. But nothing prepared me for what we encountered when we finally reached the Providence. We mobilized immediately. A cutter from our nearest station, the USCGC Hamilton, was dispatched along with a helicopter from Air Station Cape Cod. Standard protocol for a vessel in distress. The Hamilton would arrive first, approximately 6 hours out. The helicopter would be there in 90 minutes to assess the situation and provide preliminary assistance if needed. I stayed in the command center coordinating communications, trying to reach the Providence on every frequency we had. Nothing. Radio silence. Dead air on emergency channels, maritime frequencies, everything. The helicopter reached the coordinates at 5:21 hours. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Reed, reported visual contact with a large cruise vessel matching the Providence's description. The ship appeared to be operating normally. Lights were on. The vessel was maintaining course and speed. No visible damage or distress signals. But there was something odd about the scene. The pilot reported that despite the ship's apparent normal operation, there was no activity visible on the decks. No crew members, no passengers. The pools were untouched. The shuffleboard courts were empty. The observation decks were vacant. Reed attempted radio contact with the bridge. No response. He tried emergency channels. Nothing. He reported feeling a sense of unease about the situation and recommended we treat it as a potential silent emergency. A vessel operating, but potentially with a disabled communication system or crew incapacitation event. The Hamilton arrived on scene at 07:43 hours. By that time, I had the scenario fully mobilized. Rescue swimmers were standing by. Medical personnel were ready. We had 2 additional cutters en route. Everything suggested this was either a communications failure or a serious medical emergency aboard the ship. What we didn't expect was what actually greeted the boarding team. Captain Brian led the initial boarding operation. He took 4 crew members with him, a medical officer, 2 rescue swimmers, and a communications specialist. They secured alongside the Providence at 01:15 hours and began their approach. That's when things started to become strange. Brian reported that all exterior hatches were secured from the inside, not locked necessarily, but sealed. The crew had to force entry through a maintenance panel to get aboard. Once inside, they found the ship's interior completely still. No ambient noise beyond the gentle hum of the engines. No ventilation sounds. No typical ship noises. Just silence and the engines running beneath their feet. The bridge was their first destination. Standard protocol for a boarding operation. Establish communication with command. Determine the status of the vessel and crew. What they found there made Brian pause long enough that I could hear the hesitation in his voice over the radio. The bridge was empty. Completely empty. All stations were fully operational. Navigation systems were displaying current position and course. Communication systems showed no signs of malfunction. The automatic pilot was engaged, maintaining a steady heading. Everything was functioning perfectly. But there wasn't a single human being anywhere. I asked Brian where the crew was. He didn't have an answer. He ordered the medical officer to check the captain's quarters. The rest of the team began searching the bridge more thoroughly. That's when the communications specialist, a young woman named Savannah, noticed something unusual. The ship's log was open on the captain's chart table. The last entry was handwritten, dated that same morning at 03:25 hours, just 22 minutes before the distress signal. The writing started normally, documenting routine observations about weather and course. But then it deteriorated. The handwriting became frantic, the letters pressing deeper into the paper, as though written with increasing desperation. The final sentence read, "The crew is gone. They're still here, but they're gone. I can feel." And then it stopped. Mid-sentence, like the captain had simply put down the pen. I instructed Brian to continue the search. Find crew quarters, find the galley, find anywhere people might be sheltering. He acknowledged, and the team dispersed throughout the ship. What followed over the next 4 hours was a systematic exploration of a ghost ship. The Providence was operating perfectly, but it was completely devoid of human life. The medical officer encountered the infirmary stocked with supplies, but containing no patients and no staff. The galley still had food warming in the ovens. Coffee was still hot in the urns. Fresh pastries were laid out on the serving counter. Everything suggested that the crew had stepped away moments before, not hours ago. The passenger quarters were equally eerie. Beds were made, Luggage was still packed in the cabins. Personal items, photographs, toiletries, reading materials, were arranged as though their owners would return at any moment. In one cabin, a woman's jewelry was laid out on the vanity. In another, a child's stuffed animal sat propped against a pillow. One passenger had left a half-finished letter on the desk, dated that morning, describing the previous day's activities in detail. But there was no one aboard, not a single person, not in the crew quarters, not in the bridge, not anywhere. Brian reported that all lifeboats were accounted for and still secured in their davits. No evacuation had taken place. He then posed the question that I couldn't answer. Where are they? I authorized him to continue below decks, into the cargo hold, into every sealed compartment the ship possessed. It took another 3 hours. Every space was searched. Every door was opened. Every hiding place was eliminated. The Providence was empty, except for the rescue team now aboard her. But here's where the situation became truly inexplicable. As the team conducted their search, they began experiencing equipment malfunctions. Flashlights would flicker and die, only to function again moments later. Communication radios would emit bursts of static or strange frequencies that didn't correspond to any known maritime band. One rescue swimmer reported that his dive computer had malfunctioned, displaying impossible readings for depth and pressure despite the fact that he was standing on the bridge of the ship, well above water. Most disturbing was what happened to Savannah. She was documenting the bridge inventory when she reported experiencing a sudden sensation of disorientation. She said she felt like someone had just walked past her in the confined bridge space. But when she turned around, there was no one there. She reported a temperature drop of approximately 10 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of seconds. Then her recording equipment, a professional digital system, began displaying corrupted data on the screen. The file structure was intact, but the timestamps were cycling through dates from different decades. One moment the equipment showed a date from 1989. The next moment, 2001. The next moment, 1976. I made the decision to order the team back to the cutter. Something was wrong with this situation beyond a simple crew disappearance. The environmental malfunctions, the unease Savannah had described. These suggested a situation I didn't have protocols for. As the boarding team was securing the exterior hatch and preparing to depart, Brian reported something that made me reconsider everything. He said that when they'd initially boarded the ship through the maintenance panel, it had taken significant force to open the hatch. But now, as they were leaving, the same hatch opened with no resistance whatsoever, like it had never been sealed at all. Over the next 72 hours, we expanded the search area significantly. We had 6 cutters, 2 helicopters, and 2 fixed-wing aircraft searching the region. The official narrative was that there must have been an evacuation we'd missed, that the lifeboats had been somehow launched and the crew had abandoned ship. But the mathematics didn't work. All lifeboats were accounted for. The manifest showed 1,247 passengers and crew aboard. There was no way to move that many people without leaving trace evidence. Then we made a discovery that complicated everything further. A fishing vessel approximately 12 nautical miles from the Providence's last reported position transmitted that they'd encountered a lifeboat. Just one. It contained a single survivor, a woman who identified herself as part of the Providence's crew. She was rescued and brought aboard the fishing vessel. When we coordinated pickup, she was transferred to the Hamilton. Her name was Brooklyn. She'd been a steward aboard the Providence, and her testimony was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire operation. Brooklyn reported being in the crew quarters at approximately 200 hours that morning. She remembered the ship suddenly shuddering, like something had impacted it. But there was no collision, no sound of impact, no damage visible, nothing that would explain the shudder. She remembered going up to the bridge to ask about it. That's where things became strange in her account. Brooklyn said the entire crew was gathered on the bridge, but they seemed confused about why they were there. The captain was there, the officers were there, the enlisted crew were there. But when she asked them what was happening, no one could provide a coherent answer. She said it was like they were all waking up from a dream simultaneously, but couldn't remember the dream. The captain looked at his log and seemed shocked to discover that only minutes had passed since he'd last made an entry, despite it feeling like hours to everyone aboard. Brooklyn reported that she became frightened by the crew's behavior and went to find her supervisor. But when she reached the crew quarters again, everything was different. The corridors seemed longer than she remembered. The passages turned in ways she didn't expect. She became lost in her own familiar ship. She wandered for what felt like hours, finding corridors that led to dead ends, discovering sections of the ship that didn't match any deck plan she'd ever seen. Finally, in desperation, she made her way to the lifeboats. She secured one and launched it manually, abandoning the Providence without fully understanding what was happening. The lifeboat had drifted for several hours before being spotted by the fishing vessel. When I asked her what had happened to the rest of the crew and passengers, she said something that still haunts me. They're still there. They never left. But they're not themselves anymore. It's like the ship decided to keep them, like it needed them for something. I ordered her psychiatric evaluation immediately. We documented her testimony, but it was clear that whatever Brooklyn had experienced had traumatized her beyond the point of rational communication. She was eventually released to psychiatric care, and I never followed up on her case. I should have. But at that time, I was focused on a different problem. The Providence situation created an unprecedented bureaucratic crisis. We had a fully operational cruise ship in international waters with 1,246 passengers and crew unaccounted for and presumed lost, yet no evidence of any evacuation, no bodies, no debris, no wreckage, no explanation. The official report, filed months after the incident, stated that the passengers and crew had been lost at sea under circumstances undetermined. The ship itself was seized by maritime authorities and eventually scuttled, deliberately sunk, in deep water off the continental shelf. The official reason given was that the ship's systems were too corrupted to salvage and represented a hazard to navigation. But I knew the real reason. They wanted the Providence gone. They wanted no record of the ship's systems or its logs. They wanted to ensure that no one could ever board that vessel again and experience what we had experienced. I've never shared the full details of this operation with anyone outside official channels. I've kept Brooklyn's testimony classified in my personal files. I've never contacted her to check if she survived her ordeal. I've done everything I could to compartmentalize what happened on the Providence and move forward with my career. But I still think about the ship's engines running with no crew to operate them. I still think about the coffee that was warm in the galley. I still think about Savannah's terror when she felt someone walk past her in that empty bridge. And I still wonder about the 1,146 people who were aboard the Providence. I wonder if they're really gone, or if they're still somewhere aboard that ship, trapped in whatever condition Brooklyn described as kept. The worst part is that I know something similar could happen again. Right now, at this very moment, there could be other ships operating in international waters with crews that don't understand where they are or how they got there. There could be passengers trapped in corridors that shift and reshape themselves. There could be other Brooklyns, adrift in lifeboats, trying to explain the inexplicable. And the maritime authorities, they know it too. They just don't want anyone to know they know. I found a sealed room on Deck 9. I shouldn't have found it. It wasn't on the deck plan. When I opened it, I understood why they'd hidden it. My name is Brady, and I died 3 years after leaving the Celestial. At least, that's what the official records say. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know what I discovered on that ship. I need someone to understand that the cruise industry isn't what people think it is. Not all of it. Some ships operate under a completely different mandate than the one advertised to passengers. The Celestial was one of those ships. I boarded the Celestial on April 12, 2003, for what was supposed to be a 2-week Mediterranean cruise. I'd taken time off work. I'd saved for months. I was celebrating my 40th birthday. My cabin was on Deck 8, a decent mid-range suite with an ocean view. I remember unpacking, setting up my belongings, and feeling that peculiar excitement that comes with embarking on a vacation. I had no idea what I was about to discover. The first 3 days were uneventful. The ship was beautiful. The food was excellent. The entertainment was adequate. I attended shows, ate at different restaurants, made casual conversation with other passengers. I noticed something odd about the passenger distribution, though. The ship seemed less crowded than it should have been. The manifest, posted in the main atrium, listed 2,100 passengers. But I never saw anything close to that many people in the public areas. The pools were sparsely populated. The dining rooms were never fully booked. The theaters, even during evening shows, had plenty of empty seats. I mentioned this observation to a waiter named Casey during dinner one evening. Casey became noticeably nervous. She said nothing was wrong, that passenger distribution varied, that not everyone spent time in public areas. Her response was so defensive that it only made me more curious. On the 4th day, I decided to explore sections of the ship I hadn't visited yet. I took the elevator to Deck 9, which according to the directory was primarily storage and crew facilities. I wasn't supposed to be there. The sign clearly stated that deck was restricted to crew members. But the elevator doors opened and no one stopped me. So I stepped out and began walking. The corridor on Deck 9 was different from the rest of the ship. The lighting was harsher. The walls were a clinical white color instead of the pleasant beige of the passenger decks. I could hear the hum of machinery more prominently down here. Equipment sounds. I walked for several minutes, passing sealed doors with no identification markers. Everything felt sterile. Everything felt purposeful. That's when I saw it. A door that looked slightly different from the others. It had the same white frame as the rest, but the lock mechanism was more sophisticated. Electronic, not mechanical. The kind of lock that required a keycard or code. I tried the handle anyway. It didn't budge. I stood there for a moment, staring at this mysterious sealed door. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was curious. Curious in a way that made me forget I was trespassing. Forget that I was somewhere I shouldn't be. I looked around to make sure I was alone. The corridor was empty. I pulled out my room key, a basic plastic key card, and swiped it against the lock, fully expecting nothing to happen. The lock clicked. The door slid open. What I encountered inside was a space that shouldn't have existed. A laboratory. Full-sized, professional laboratory equipment. Computer terminals, medical diagnostic equipment, video monitoring systems, filing cabinets. Everything arranged with clinical precision. The room was approximately 30 feet by 20 feet, completely sealed, with no windows and only one exit. The door I'd just come through. I stepped inside and the door slid shut behind me. Panic should have set in. But instead, I felt a strange compulsion to understand what I was looking at. I moved to the nearest computer terminal and attempted to access it. No password required. The system was already logged in, displaying monitoring feeds from various locations around the ship. I could see passenger cabins, multiple camera angles showing people in their rooms, people changing clothes, people showering, people sleeping, surveillance, systematic, pervasive surveillance of the passenger quarters. I navigated the file system and discovered video archives, months of recorded footage. I clicked randomly through timestamps and dates, watching hours of passenger activity being recorded and stored. Then I looked at the filing cabinets. I opened one at random. Inside were medical records, patient files. But the names had been replaced with numbers. Passenger 457, passenger 1023, passenger 382. Each file contained medical data, blood types, genetic markers, pharmaceutical responses, psychological evaluations. There were charts tracking physical changes over time, graphs showing behavioral modifications, notes written in clinical language describing subject progress, and integration protocols. I was standing in the middle of something massive, something institutional, something designed to remain hidden. That's when I noticed the camera pointed at me, a small black dome in the ceiling corner. I looked at it and realized that whatever I was documenting by being in this room was being documented back at me. They knew I was here. They'd known the moment my keycard opened that door. I moved quickly through the remaining files, photographing documents with a disposable camera I had in my pocket. I took pictures of the computer screens. I documented what I could before the door opened and security personnel appeared. They didn't say anything. They just stood there, 3 uniformed figures blocking the doorway. One of them said, "You're not authorized to be in this area, sir. You need to come with us." I complied. I had no choice. They escorted me through the corridors, away from Deck 9, back to the passenger areas. One of them took my room key. He said I would be receiving new accommodations in a different suite. They didn't threaten me. They didn't intimidate me. They simply made it clear that my freedom of movement had been revoked. My new cabin was on Deck 3, interior cabin, no window. It was significantly smaller than my original suite. When I tried to leave, I discovered that my new keycard only opened that cabin and the nearby corridor section. I was confined to a restricted area of the ship with limited access. I spent that evening examining my photographs. The camera had captured images of several documents, medical records for passengers who'd supposedly completed previous cruises on the Celestial, genetic analysis reports, psychological evaluation forms. There was a pattern in the data. Certain passenger profiles were being selected, certain characteristics were being monitored, certain modifications were being tracked. And there was a manifest, a real manifest, not the one posted in the atrium. This manifest listed 1,450 passengers, not 2,100. It listed them by number, not by name, and next to each number were annotations. Integration Phase 1, Integration Phase 2, Integration Phase 3, Retention, Discharge. I realized with horror what was being done on this ship. The Celestial wasn't a cruise ship. It was a floating laboratory. The passengers weren't vacation seekers. They were test subjects. And I had been selected as one of them. I attempted to contact the authorities. I tried accessing the communication systems in my cabin. The phone in my room had no external line. The internet connection didn't work. I tried to locate a crew member to assist me, but every person I encountered directed me back to my cabin. One crew member named Shepard told me that all passenger concerns would be addressed at the end of the voyage. Over the following days, I observed patterns I hadn't noticed before. Certain passengers would disappear from the public areas. They'd vanish for a day or two, then reappear looking different. Slightly disoriented, moving differently, speaking with less engagement in their voices. I watched as these passengers were gradually integrated back into the general population, like they were being reintroduced to society after some modification. I also noticed that I was being watched. My cabin was monitored. I could see the camera in the ventilation grate once I knew what to look for. When I went to the dining room, crew members seemed to track my movements. When I went to the observation deck, security personnel appeared nearby. I was under constant observation. Then I discovered something in my cabin that changed everything. A small device hidden in my pillow. A medical monitoring apparatus. The kind used to track biometric data, heart rate, body temperature, neural activity. They weren't just watching me. They were measuring me, analyzing my body's responses, understanding my biological baseline so they could track any changes. That's when I made my decision. I had to get off this ship. I had to reach someone who could understand what was happening. I couldn't wait for the voyage to end. By then, whatever modifications they had planned for me would be complete. I waited until night. I gathered my photographs and the monitoring device I'd removed from my pillow. I made my way through the corridors, using the knowledge I'd gained about the ship's layout from my exploration. I knew there were areas with less surveillance, areas where crew access was limited. I reached one of the lower deck areas, near the waterline. I encountered a maintenance access that led to the exterior hull. It took me 20 minutes to figure out how to unlock it. When I finally got it open, I could see the ocean beyond. Dark water, moonlight reflecting off the surface. The ship was moving at approximately 15 knots. The water was cold, but the alternative, staying aboard, undergoing whatever procedures they had planned, was worse. I jumped. I don't remember the impact. I remember the cold water overwhelming my senses. I remember kicking toward the surface. I remember breaking through into air and breathing. And I remember the ship continuing on its course, leaving me behind in the dark water. I was in the ocean for approximately 4 hours before a cargo vessel spotted me. They pulled me aboard, gave me dry clothes, and called for medical assistance. I was transferred to a hospital in Gibraltar. I recovered from hypothermia and dehydration. I told them everything. The authorities listened to my story. They took my photographs. They took the monitoring device. They assured me they would investigate. Then, 2 days later, a man in a suit came to my hospital room and told me that an investigation would not be proceeding. He said the Celestial was a legitimate cruise vessel operating under international maritime law. He said my accusations were unfounded. He said I should consider not making these allegations publicly, as they could result in legal consequences for defamation. He left an envelope on my bedside table. Inside was a settlement agreement, a significant amount of money, the kind of money that could change someone's life. All I had to do was sign it and agree to never discuss the Celestial, never make allegations, never contact any authorities or media about my experience. I didn't sign it immediately. I tried to reach journalists. I tried to access maritime regulatory agencies. Every door was closed. Every person I spoke to suddenly became unavailable. It was like someone had made a call, and every institution had decided that my story was a liability. The money in that envelope represented 3 years of my salary. I had a family. I had bills. I had a life that could be significantly improved by accepting what they were offering and remaining silent. In the end, I signed the agreement. But I kept one photograph, one document that I captured inside that laboratory. It was the passenger manifest, the list of all the test subjects aboard the Celestial. I kept it hidden for years, waiting for an opportunity to release it. That opportunity never came. Every time I considered going public, I would receive a letter. A reminder that I'd signed an agreement, a subtle threat that legal action would be taken, a message that I should remain silent. I lived with this knowledge for 3 years. I watched news reports about the Celestial continuing to operate. I read passenger reviews online, describing it as a luxury cruise experience. I saw families booking voyages on a ship that was conducting unauthorized medical experiments on its passengers. Then, 3 years later, I was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition. The doctors were baffled. They said it was extremely unusual, the kind of condition that typically only appeared in specific ethnic populations. But there was no genetic predisposition in my family. No explanation for why I had developed this condition. Unless, of course, it had been deliberately introduced during my time aboard the Celestial. Unless the modifications they'd planned for me had been partially completed before I escaped. I'm dying from this condition. The doctors give me perhaps another year, maybe 2 if I'm fortunate. I won't see my daughter graduate high school. I won't see my son get married. I'll die from a disease that was designed in a laboratory on a cruise ship and implemented without my consent. I'm writing this now because I need to be sure that at least one person knows the truth. I need to be certain that when I'm gone, the evidence survives. The photograph I kept, the passenger manifest, it's hidden where it can be discovered after my death. It contains information, numbers, data that will help investigators understand what was really happening on the Celestial. The ship is still operating, still taking passengers, still conducting whatever experiments they've refined in the years since I escaped. And I'm dying because I was curious enough to open a door that wasn't supposed to open. Because I wanted to understand what was hidden on Deck 9. But at least now you know. At least the truth has a chance to survive. There were 12 of us in the lifeboat. We watched the horizon sail away. We watched the smoke. We watched the lights go out. And then we realized the rescue never came. Not for 4 months. But we were only missing for 3 days. My name is Malcolm, and I'm still not entirely sure which version of events is true. I've tried to reconcile the timeline, the evidence, the official reports, with what I remember experiencing. None of it aligns. None of it makes sense. But I need to document what happened, because the other survivors, the ones I can still reach, they're experiencing memory loss. They're forgetting details. Some of them are forgetting that entire weeks happened at all. I'm terrified that if I don't record this now, the truth will vanish along with our memories. We were on a 7-day cruise aboard the Horizon. 12 passengers and a crew of approximately 200. The ship was a mid-sized vessel operating in the Caribbean, offering what was marketed as a budget luxury experience. I was traveling alone, taking a break from work. It was October 1998. The weather reports had predicted clear skies and calm seas throughout the voyage. On the 4th night of the cruise, something catastrophic happened. I was in my cabin when I felt a violent shudder run through the entire ship. Not the gentle motion of waves, something violent, something wrong. I got out of bed and went to the corridor. Other passengers were emerging from their cabins, confused, asking if anyone knew what was happening. The crew was nowhere to be seen. The shuddering stopped, but it was replaced by something worse. The sound of alarms. Not the typical fire alarm or emergency signal. Something I'd never heard before. a sound that made your teeth ache and your skin crawl. It was a frequency that seemed to activate something primitive in your nervous system. Fear. Pure, instinctual fear. An announcement came over the intercom system. The voice was steady, professional, but there was something artificial about it. Like it was being generated by a computer rather than spoken by a human. The message said, "All passengers report to muster stations. This is an emergency evacuation. Repeat, this is an emergency evacuation. Report to your designated muster stations immediately." I made my way to the muster station assigned during the safety drill on embarkation day. It was on the upper deck, near the lifeboats. When I arrived, I encountered approximately 12 other passengers already there. We were confused, frightened, asking each other questions that no one could answer. The crew members were there, but they weren't communicating. They were simply standing at their stations, waiting. Then a captain appeared. He looked normal at first glance, but there was something in his demeanor that seemed off. He announced that the Horizon had experienced a critical system failure. The ship's navigation and propulsion systems had failed simultaneously. The vessel was taking on water. Evacuation was necessary. We were to board the lifeboats immediately. I looked around at the other passengers. There were 12 of us, as I said. I remember some of their faces. There was a couple in their 60s. A woman traveling with her teenage daughter. Her name was Georgia, a businessman. Several solo travelers like myself. We were herded toward the lifeboat with minimal ceremony. The crew helped us aboard, handed us life jackets, and began the launch sequence. As the lifeboat descended toward the water, I looked back at the horizon. The ship was still lit up. All the lights were on. I couldn't see any visible damage. There was no visible list to the vessel. No indication that it was taking on water. But the crew was insistent that evacuation was necessary, so we didn't question it further. We hit the water, and the lifeboat's engine started. A crew member operating it began moving us away from the ship. I watched the horizon recede into the darkness. Then suddenly, every light on the ship went out simultaneously, not gradually dimming, not section by section, all of them at once, like someone had flipped a master switch and plunged the entire vessel into darkness. And then we heard the sound. A sound like nothing I've ever experienced before or since. A low, resonant sound that seemed to come from the ship itself. A sound that felt almost like a scream, but emanating from metal and machinery rather than a living throat. It lasted for approximately 30 seconds. Then silence. The crew member told us that the horizon was going down. We needed to maintain distance to avoid being pulled under by the suction. We did as instructed, watching the dark shape of the ship sitting silent on the water. We waited for the rescue signal. The crew member said the ship's emergency beacon would be transmitting our position. Rescue would arrive within hours. That's what we thought. That's what he told us. That's what the official protocols dictated. But the hours passed strangely in that lifeboat. The night seemed longer than it should have been. The sky didn't brighten the way I expected it to. When morning finally came, I was shocked to discover that my watch showed only 4 hours had passed. But I was certain we'd been in the boat for much longer. The other passengers confirmed it. We all felt like we'd been adrift for 10 or 12 hours, at least. Georgia mentioned that her watch was acting strangely. It would skip ahead, then jump backward. The businessman suggested that we were all just disoriented, that trauma distorts time perception. We accepted that explanation. What else could we do? But as the day progressed, other inconsistencies emerged. My beard growth. I hadn't shaved before boarding the ship, and I have coarse facial hair that grows quickly. But when I felt my face, I had what appeared to be 3 or 4 days of growth. The same was true for other men in the lifeboat. And the women, several of them mentioned that their hair felt longer than it should have been. George's daughter pointed out that the food in the lifeboat's emergency stores had expiration dates. She noticed that some of the packaging looked aged. The dates on the cans, they were from 1995. That shouldn't have been possible. These were supposed to be current emergency supplies. We were all becoming uneasy, but we didn't voice our concerns directly. We rationalized. We made excuses. The supplies were old stock. Our perception of time was distorted by stress. The beard growth was a trick of perspective. We were tired and scared and not thinking clearly. Then the rescue ship appeared on the horizon. It was a large vessel, military designation, approaching at high speed. The crew members signaled them using a handheld beacon. They responded immediately, altered course to intercept us. Within an hour, we were being pulled aboard the rescue vessel. The crew welcomed us warmly. They told us we were fortunate to be alive. They told us our ship had sunk 3 hours after we'd evacuated. They told us rescue operations had located us within the standard search perimeter. They took us below deck, gave us dry clothes, food, water. We were questioned about the evacuation process, the ship's condition, the circumstances leading to the sinking. We answered as best we could, given that most of us still weren't entirely sure what had happened. Then they told us something that didn't match what we remembered. They said we'd been missing for 3 days. 3 days. They said the horizon had sent out a distress signal approximately 48 hours after we left port. Search and rescue operations had been initiated immediately. They'd located us 12 hours ago, which made our total time adrift approximately 2.5 days. 2.5 days. But I'd felt like we were in that lifeboat for weeks. I mentioned the discrepancy to one of the naval officers. He looked at me strangely. He said that wasn't uncommon in survival situations. Time distortion was a documented psychological phenomenon. We'd been through trauma. Our minds were playing tricks on us. But then he added something that made my blood go cold. He said, "However, we did note some unusual aspects of your case. Your rescue position was approximately 400 nautical miles from where the distress beacon indicated. That's an extreme deviation. We're not sure how your lifeboat could have drifted that far in such a short time, even with significant ocean currents." The crew member who was with us throughout this conversation didn't respond. He just stared at something beyond the officer's shoulder, like he was looking at something that wasn't in the room. We were transported to the nearest port, which was in Puerto Rico. We underwent medical evaluations. All of us were found to be in surprisingly good health, given that we'd supposedly been adrift for almost 3 days without fresh water. Most people in that situation would show significant signs of dehydration. We didn't. Our skin was actually in better condition than it should have been. The doctors were puzzled. They ran tests. They took blood samples. They examined us thoroughly. But they found nothing physically wrong with us. They concluded that we'd been fortunate. Very fortunate. Lucky enough to survive an ordeal that would typically have claimed lives. The media covered the horizon sinking briefly. There were a few news reports about the mysterious circumstances of the ship's failure. Then, almost immediately, the coverage stopped. The news cycle moved on. The story was no longer discussed. I tried to locate archived articles about it later, but they were sparse. The major outlets seemed to have minimal coverage. It was like the story had been deliberately deprioritized. I returned home after that experience. I tried to resume my normal life. But something had shifted in my perception of reality. I kept thinking about the inconsistencies, the timeline that didn't match, the supplies with dates from years before, the strange frequency of the alarm sound. I attempted to contact the other survivors. The businessman didn't answer my calls. The couple in their 60s were impossible to locate. Georgia, the woman who'd been traveling with her daughter, I finally reached after weeks of trying. When I spoke to her, she seemed confused. She said she didn't remember much about the lifeboat. She said she'd been having nightmares about being adrift for months. But that wasn't right, was it? We were only missing for 3 days. Georgia said something that chilled me. I remember 4 months, Malcolm. I remember being in that lifeboat for 4 months. We were rationing the food. We were running out of fresh water. We were losing hope that rescue would come. I remember the exact moment the rescue ship appeared. It was day 127 in that lifeboat. I counted every single day. But the official record said 3 days. I've spent the past 25 years trying to reconcile what I experienced with what the official timeline documents. I've read the naval reports. I've examined the news articles. I've contacted the other survivors, or tried to. Most of them won't discuss the experience. Some of them have experienced psychological breaks, according to mutual acquaintances. Some of them have moved to remote locations, away from major population centers. There was a support group formed by some of the survivors. I joined it for a brief period. The meetings were disturbing. People would share conflicting memories of the same events. One person would describe being in the lifeboat for weeks. Another would insist it was only days. A third person would describe rescue scenes that didn't match anyone else's recollection. And then there were the nightmares. Everyone in that support group was having nightmares about being adrift in that lifeboat. Nightmares about the water turning dark. Nightmares about shapes moving beneath the surface of the ocean. I left the support group after 3 meetings. The collective disorientation was too unsettling. Now, looking back on the experience with the perspective of 25 years, I have to consider possibilities that seem impossible, but might be true. What if we weren't in that lifeboat for 3 days? What if the official rescue timeline is a fabrication? What if we actually were adrift for months, and our memories of that extended duration are being suppressed or overwritten by something beyond our understanding or control? What if the horizon didn't sink at all, but instead something else happened? Something the authorities felt compelled to conceal. I think about the crew member who operated our lifeboat. I've tried to locate any record of him. Nothing. His name doesn't appear in any maritime employment records. It's like he never existed. Yet, I have a clear memory of his face. I can describe every detail of his appearance. I think about the alarm sound on the horizon, that frequency that activated something primal in our nervous systems. I've never heard anything like it before or since. But there are moments when I hear a distant sound, a siren, a musical note, even the wind sometimes, and I'm transported back to that moment. I feel the same terror, the same sense of impending change. The horizon eventually resurfaced in maritime history, but not in the way I would have expected. Reports filed years after the incident documented that a ship matching the horizon's description was spotted in international waters, operating under a different flag and with a different name. The photographs showed significant structural modifications. The ship was no longer in service on standard cruise routes. But I've tried to verify these reports, and they seem to exist only in obscure maritime forums and conspiracy-oriented websites. They're not part of the official historical record. I'm writing this account now because I'm running out of time. I'm 67 years old, and my health is declining. I have degenerative neurological symptoms that my doctors can't explain. I'm experiencing memory loss. Sometimes I forget years of my life. Sometimes I forget faces of people I've known for decades. I'm terrified that the truth about what happened on the horizon will die with me. I don't know if we were in that lifeboat for 3 days or 4 months. I don't know if the horizon actually sank or if something else occurred. I don't know if the crew member was human or something else entirely. I don't know if the memories I have of extended time adrift are real or if they're being artificially implanted in my mind as some form of psychological warfare. But I know something happened. Something that defied the normal rules of reality. Something that caused time to behave strangely. Something that frightened the authorities enough to conceal it. And the worst part is that I'm not sure if I'm the only one who remembers. I'm not sure if the other survivors are genuinely confused about the timeline, or if they've been deliberately silenced. I'm not sure if the memories in my head are actually my own, or if they belong to someone else. All I know is this. Whatever happened on that lifeboat, it fundamentally altered my understanding of what reality is. And I'm terrified that it's happening again, right now, on other ships operating in international waters. The horizon is still out there somewhere, still operating under a different name, still carrying passengers who will experience things that defy explanation. And no one will believe them when they try to describe what happened. Because the official timeline will always contradict their testimony. The authorities will always provide a rational explanation, and time itself will be rewritten to match the narrative they've chosen to establish. I'm documenting this account in hopes that someone will believe me, in hopes that someone will investigate what really happened, in hopes that the truth will survive even after my memory fails completely. But I have a feeling that no matter what I write, no matter how much evidence I provide, the story will be forgotten. Just like the media coverage of the horizon sinking was forgotten. Just like the names of the other survivors are fading from my memory. Just like reality itself seems to be fading away. My father was a captain. The official cause was human error. But I found his personal log hidden in his office after he disappeared with the ship. What he wrote in those final days wasn't error. It was intent. My name is Gabriella, and I've spent 18 years trying to understand why my father deliberately steered the Majestic into oblivion. The official investigation concluded that Captain Christian had made a navigational error that led to the ship sinking in 2007. Poor judgment, a momentary lapse in concentration, tragic accident. The Maritime Board issued their report, the insurance companies settled their claims, and the incident was filed away in the archives of maritime disasters. But I knew my father. I knew him better than anyone alive. And I knew that the man I'd known my entire life, meticulous, cautious, obsessive about maritime safety, would never make the kind of error that would endanger a ship carrying over 2,000 passengers and crew. Something else was happening. Something deliberate. And the personal log I discovered hidden behind a false panel in his office desk proved it. I was going through his belongings 3 weeks after the Majestic disappeared with all souls aboard. My mother had died 2 years earlier. My brother had moved overseas. It fell to me to process the logistics of my father's life. His house, his possessions, his paperwork. I was in his study, opening filing cabinets, when I noticed that one drawer seemed shallower than it should have been. I investigated, located the false panel, and behind it was a leather journal. The first entry was dated 6 months before the voyage. My father's handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its regularity. He wrote, "I've been approached. They know who I am. They know what I've done. They know about the money. They're offering me an ultimatum. Comply with their request, or everything comes to light. I have to protect Gabriella and her future. I have no choice. I didn't understand what he meant. What money? What had my father done? But as I read further through the journal, a picture emerged that shattered everything I thought I knew about him. Approximately 8 years before the Majestic disappeared, my father had been in financial trouble. His first marriage, to my mother, was ending. The divorce settlement was substantial. My brother was in medical school. I was in college. The expenses were overwhelming. My father made a decision that he'd regretted ever since. He'd accepted a payment from someone, a substantial payment. In exchange, he'd provided information about port security procedures at various maritime terminals. Information that could have been used for trafficking, smuggling, or worse. He never documented what the information was used for, and he spent years trying to convince himself that it hadn't contributed to anything harmful. Then, in the months leading up to the Majestic voyage, someone had contacted him. They reminded him of his past transgression. They told him they had documentation. They told him they could destroy everything he'd built, his reputation, his career, his relationship with his children, unless he did something for them. The journal entries became increasingly desperate. The handwriting deteriorated. Pressure began to show in the margins and line spacing. My father wrote about sleepless nights, about meetings with people he was afraid to identify by name, about being shown photographs that proved the extent of their knowledge about his past indiscretion. One entry, dated 3 weeks before the final voyage, read, "They want me to deviate the Majestic's route by approximately 40 nautical miles from the planned course. They've provided specific coordinates. They say the ship will experience a controlled mechanical failure that will render it inoperable. A rescue ship will arrive within hours. All passengers and crew will be evacuated safely. It will appear to be an accident. I'll be blamed for navigational incompetence. My career will be over, but everyone will survive." That's what they promised. But I don't believe them. I don't believe that anything about this is designed to be survivable. My hands were shaking as I read that entry. My father, the man I'd known my entire life, had steered a ship full of innocent people toward a deliberately engineered disaster. Whether he'd believed that everyone would survive or not, he'd willingly participated in whatever plot these mysterious people had orchestrated. I contacted the Maritime authorities with the journal. I gave them the original, showed them the hidden compartment, explained everything I'd discovered. The lead investigator, a man named Bowen, reviewed the contents carefully. Then he told me something that changed my entire understanding of the situation. The Maritime Board already knew about the deviation. It was documented in the ship's navigation logs. The board had concluded that my father had miscalculated the coordinates, that his error had contributed to the ship's loss. But the official report hadn't made this clear to the public. The narrative they'd presented was that the captain had become disoriented due to fatigue and had made a navigation error that happened to coincide with a catastrophic propulsion system failure. 2 separate accidents occurring simultaneously. Tragic bad luck. But the journal suggested something different. The journal suggested that the deviation wasn't accidental. And it suggested that my father knew that whoever was pressuring him wasn't being truthful about the safety protocols they'd promised. I asked Bowen why the Maritime Board hadn't investigated the connections I'd revealed in the journal. Why hadn't they pursued the mystery people who had contacted my father? Why hadn't they tried to determine what the controlled mechanical failure actually was? Bowen looked uncomfortable. He said the investigation was ongoing. He said there were aspects of the case that were still being analyzed. He said I should be patient and allow the proper authorities to do their work. Then, 10 days later, a man in an expensive suit came to my apartment. He didn't identify himself. He didn't introduce himself with any official title. He simply handed me an envelope and said, "Your father's legacy depends on your discretion." Inside the envelope was a settlement agreement, a substantial amount of money, 7 figures, more than enough to set me up for life. In exchange, I would sign a document agreeing never to discuss the contents of my father's journal with anyone, never to speak to media outlets about the circumstances of the Majestic's sinking, never to contact the Maritime authorities with additional information, never to attempt to identify or pursue the people who had contacted my father. I refused. I told the man that I wanted to know who had killed 2,147 people. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know what controlled mechanical failure actually meant. I wanted to know if anyone else had been pressured into cooperation the way my father had been. The man listened politely to my entire speech. Then he said, "Your father received $5 million for his cooperation. That money is now in trust, attached to your name. If you sign this agreement, the money is released to you immediately. If you don't sign, we have documentation of the transaction. We have evidence that your father was actively complicit in a criminal conspiracy. We have proof that he knew passengers were at risk and proceeded with the voyage anyway. If you pursue this matter further, we will ensure that your father's name becomes synonymous with one of the worst maritime disasters in history. He'll be remembered not as a victim, but as a mass murderer. His legacy will be obliterated. His memory will be poison." He left the envelope with me. He left a pen on my coffee table. He said I had 48 hours to make a decision. I didn't sleep for those 48 hours. I sat with my father's journal, reading and rereading his final entries. I thought about the man I'd known, the man who'd taken me sailing when I was a child, the man who taught me to navigate by the stars, the man who told me that the most important responsibility a captain has is the safety of everyone aboard his vessel. That man couldn't be a mass murderer. But the evidence in the journal suggested that he'd been complicit in something catastrophic. Whether through coercion or personal failing, he'd participated in events that resulted in the death of everyone aboard the Majestic. I signed the agreement. I took the money. I stopped pursuing answers. Because the alternative was to destroy my father's memory, and I didn't have the strength to do that. The money sits in a bank account that I barely touch. I don't spend it. I don't invest it. I don't use it to improve my life. It represents a bargain I made with people whose names I'll never know, for reasons I'll never fully understand. It represents my father's life, valued at $5 million. It represents the lives of 2,147 people on the Majestic, valued at nothing. Over the years, I've tried to piece together what actually happened. I've conducted research on my own time, following leads that go nowhere, pursuing contacts that refuse to speak with me, trying to understand the context my father was operating in. What I've learned is this. The Majestic wasn't the only ship that disappeared under mysterious circumstances. There was a vessel in 2003 that went down in a region that had been specifically cleared of rescue operations. There was a fishing fleet in 1999 that was never located despite extensive search efforts. There were dozens of incidents scattered across decades, each with its own official explanation, each buried under layers of bureaucracy and settlement agreements. I believe that my father was one of many people who were blackmailed into cooperation with something larger than he understood. I believe that the controlled mechanical failure he was promised never happened as described. I believe that whatever occurred aboard the Majestic, it wasn't what the official Maritime Board concluded. But I'll never know for certain. I signed away my right to pursue the truth. I accepted money that I can't ethically spend. I live with the knowledge that my father's final act was complicity in a catastrophe, and I've chosen silence to protect his memory. The journal still sits in a locked box in my closet. Sometimes I take it out and read it, knowing that no one else will ever be allowed to see those pages. Knowing that the answers my father struggled with will die with me. Knowing that somewhere there are people who orchestrated the sinking of the Majestic, and they're still operating. Still pressuring captains, still orchestrating disasters, still collecting settlements from families who choose silence over truth. I wonder if they've already identified the next captain. I wonder if someone else is sitting in their office right now, reading a message that explains how their past indiscretion has been discovered and can be used against them. I wonder how many ships are sailing right now with captains who know something is wrong but feel powerless to stop it. My father wrote in his final journal entry, "If anyone ever reads this, know that I made a choice. Not the right choice, not the brave choice, but a choice. I chose my family's comfort over the lives of strangers. I'll die knowing that decision. I hope I have the strength to face that judgment." He never got the chance to face any judgment. He died with everyone else aboard the Majestic, his complicity dying with him, his motivations and his desperation known only to me and the people who blackmailed him into cooperation, and I've chosen to let that knowledge die with me as well. I was the ship's doctor. Within 6 hours, the infirmary was full. But nobody was sick. They all had the same symptom. They couldn't remember why they were there. My name is Lionel, and I've spent 14 years trying to explain what happened aboard the Tranquility in the spring of 2011. The official medical report concluded that there was a localized outbreak of a rare neurological condition, something similar to transient global amnesia, but with characteristics that didn't quite match any documented disease. The ship's medical authority quarantined the affected passengers, implemented isolation protocols, and coordinated with coastal medical facilities for advanced treatment. The diagnosis was eventually deemed inconclusive. The cases resolved spontaneously. The incident was classified as a medical anomaly without clear etiology. But I was there. I watched it happen. And I know that no known neurological condition behaves the way that outbreak behaved. The Tranquility was a mid-sized luxury cruise vessel operating in the Eastern Caribbean. I'd been employed as the ship's physician for approximately 2 years. My role involved providing routine medical care, managing minor emergencies, and coordinating with mainland hospitals for serious cases. It was generally uneventful work. The most common conditions I treated were gastrointestinal disturbances, seasickness, and minor injuries from passenger activities. The morning of April 14, 2011, started normally. I had finished my standard rounds, confirmed that the infirmary was adequately stocked, and was reviewing medical supplies inventory when the first patient arrived. A woman in her 50s, appearing agitated and confused. She said she didn't remember boarding the ship. She didn't remember the previous day. She didn't remember her cabin number or her travel companions. Her vital signs were stable. Her neurological examination was normal. Her blood chemistry was unremarkable. Physically, she was healthy. Cognitively, there was a clear gap in her recent memory. I admitted her to one of the infirmary's observation beds and began diagnostic workup. Standard protocol for acute amnesia. I ordered a CT scan of the head. We had imaging equipment aboard the larger luxury vessels. The scan showed no abnormalities, no hemorrhage, no evidence of stroke, No structural brain damage. The patient's amnesia appeared to be purely functional without organic cause. By mid-afternoon, I had 3 more patients with identical presentations, all experiencing memory loss for recent events, all with normal vital signs and unremarkable laboratory findings, all with normal neuroimaging, all appearing otherwise healthy. By early evening, I had 17 patients. By midnight, I had 43. The pattern was undeniable. Patients were arriving at the infirmary in escalating numbers, all with the same complaint: recent memory loss. Most could remember their names, their occupations, their families. But everything regarding the current voyage was missing. They didn't remember boarding. They didn't remember their cabins. They didn't remember the activities of the previous day. Some patients claimed they couldn't remember the previous week. I escalated the situation to the ship's medical authority, the captain's office, coordinating with our corporate medical director on shore. I recommended that we begin isolation protocols immediately. If this was an infectious process, viral, bacterial, or prion-based, we needed to contain it. If it was environmental, we needed to identify and eliminate the source. The captain authorized me to implement medical quarantine. The affected passengers were moved to a specialized ward that could be sealed and isolated from the rest of the ship. All crew members who'd had close contact with affected passengers were monitored closely for symptom development. But the isolation failed. Within 18 hours of establishing the quarantine, staff members who'd been providing care to the isolated patients began developing the same symptoms. Nurses, orderlies, cleaning personnel, all presenting with acute memory loss. And not just for recent events. Several staff members reported memory gaps extending backward weeks or months. I implemented stricter isolation protocols, full hazmat precautions for anyone entering the quarantine ward. But it didn't matter. The spread continued. The contamination, if it was contamination, had already penetrated beyond containment. I began keeping detailed records of the outbreak. Every patient, their symptom timeline, their memory loss extent, their vital signs, their imaging results. I was meticulous. Medical accuracy requires documentation. If this was going to be studied, analyzed, or reviewed, it would need solid data. By the end of the second day, I had over 200 patients in the infirmary and medical observation areas. The ship's available medical facilities were overwhelmed. I was working without sleep, rationing staff, trying to coordinate advanced care for a condition that was completely outside my experience and expertise. The ship diverted to Port Royal, Jamaica. We coordinated with Jamaican health authorities. Several patients were transferred to mainland hospitals for more advanced evaluation. But the hospitals couldn't explain what they were seeing either. The transferred patients had the same presentation: selective memory loss with normal neurological findings. Some patients began recovering spontaneously. Others remained amnesic. It was during the second night of the outbreak that I made the discovery that should have changed everything. I was reviewing medical records on the ship's computer system, trying to identify any commonality among the affected patients. Shared meals, shared spaces, shared air handling systems, anything that might explain the clustering. I was accessing the electronic medical database to pull historical records when I noticed something odd. The files were being modified in real time. Not by me, not by any staff member I was aware of. The modification timestamps showed changes being made to patient records. But when I checked the files on the physical server, the same records showed different information. The electronic copies being accessed from the main terminal were being altered, but the original files on the backup system were unchanged. I made copies of both versions, the altered and the unaltered records, and brought them to my office. I printed them out manually, creating physical documentation that couldn't be remotely modified. What I discovered was disturbing. The altered records showed diagnosis codes for documented neurological conditions. The unaltered records showed blank diagnostic fields with no definitive diagnosis recorded. It was like someone was attempting to provide retroactive explanations for something that had never been properly explained. I also noticed something else in my personal logs that I'd been keeping on a password-protected file on my personal computer. I was reviewing the timeline of symptom presentations when I realized that my own entries showed gaps. I had written detailed notes about the first appearance of symptoms on April 14th. But I also had entries dated April 12th and 13th that I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was similar enough to be mine, but the content was foreign to me. In those forgotten entries, I had documented symptoms appearing among the crew. Early cases of memory loss that predated the passenger outbreak by 2 days. In the forgotten entries, I was noting that the outbreak had already begun to spread. In the forgotten entries, I was expressing concern about containment failure. I didn't remember writing any of that. I didn't remember those 2 days in any coherent way. My first conscious memory of the outbreak was the afternoon of April 14th when the first passenger arrived at the infirmary. Had I lost my memory? Had I experienced the same neurological condition affecting everyone else and forgotten the experience? Or had someone deliberately altered my personal records? I tried to access the original files. They were gone, deleted from the system. The only record of those 2 days was in the altered version that someone had modified. The record that showed those early cases as something other than amnesia. The record that suggested I'd been monitoring something different than what I actually experienced. I reported this to the ship's medical director on shore. I told her about the record alterations. I told her about my missing memories. I told her that something was wrong with this outbreak, something that didn't fit any natural disease pattern. Her response was immediate and concerning. She told me to stop investigating. She told me to focus on patient care. She told me that the outbreak appeared to be self-limiting. Patients were recovering. The situation was stabilizing. There was no need to pursue investigative concerns at this time. I asked her directly if the records had been altered by someone in her office. She didn't answer. She just said the call was being terminated and that I should expect contact from corporate counsel regarding my position. The Tranquility continued to port in Jamaica. Most of the affected passengers eventually disembarked and were transferred to mainland medical facilities. Most of them recovered their memories within days. Those who experienced longer-lasting amnesia received advanced neurological evaluation, but the underlying cause was never identified. The ship's voyage was curtailed. We returned to Miami ahead of schedule. I was informed that my employment contract was being terminated due to medical and professional concerns. I wasn't given specifics. I was simply told that my services were no longer required and that I would be released with severance if I agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I didn't sign it immediately. I tried to pursue the investigation independently. I attempted to contact the patients who'd been transferred to mainland hospitals. None of them would speak with me. I attempted to access the medical records through official channels. I was denied access. I attempted to contact the ship's corporate medical director again. She would not return my calls. Then I received a letter from a law firm. It explained that I was involved in a confidential matter related to my employment with the cruise line. It stated that the company had extensive documentation of my medical incompetence and professional misconduct. It suggested that civil litigation would be avoided if I accepted the severance package and signed the confidentiality agreement. If I refused, the letter explained, The company would pursue legal action and would make my medical record available to licensing boards and professional associations. My career would be over. I signed the agreement. I took the severance. I left the maritime medical field entirely. But I kept copies of the records, the physical printouts I'd made, the altered and unaltered versions, the timeline of my own memory gaps. I've kept them hidden in a storage unit for 14 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal them, waiting for someone with the authority to investigate, waiting for a way to make sense of what I experienced without destroying my own professional reputation. What I believe happened is this. Something caused an outbreak of acute amnesia aboard the Tranquility. Whether it was environmental, infectious, or something else entirely, I don't know. But the outbreak occurred earlier than the official record indicates. It began affecting crew members before affecting passengers. And for reasons I'll probably never understand, someone deliberately altered the medical records to obscure the timeline. The altered records served a purpose. They provided a definitive diagnosis for a condition that had none. They provided a clear etiology for symptoms that had no clear cause. They provided a professional, rational explanation for something that defied rational explanation. The recovered passengers reported, to the few people who would listen to them, that they'd experienced treatment lasting weeks or months aboard the Tranquility. They described medical interventions, medications, procedures. But according to the official record, they were only aboard the ship for days. Some of them developed neurological symptoms months after the voyage. Cognitive difficulties, memory problems, personality changes. Their physicians attributed these symptoms to the original amnesia episode. But in speaking with a few of these patients privately, before I was threatened into silence, they described their symptoms as different from their initial amnesia. They described changes that felt more like deliberate neural modification than natural disease recovery. I believe that the Tranquility wasn't experiencing an outbreak of natural disease. I believe that something was being done to the passengers, something that required memory alteration to facilitate or conceal. And I believe that when the process failed, when the alterations became too widespread to contain, the records were altered retrospectively to create a plausible alternate explanation. But I'll probably never be able to prove any of this. The evidence has been destroyed or classified. The affected passengers are scattered across the world. The ship's crew has been dispersed. And I'm bound by a confidentiality agreement that prevents me from publicly discussing what I witnessed. All I have is my personal knowledge. All I have is the certainty that I experienced something aboard the Tranquility that the official record refuses to acknowledge. And all I have is the hollow hope that eventually someone will want to understand the truth enough to pursue it, and they'll find the copies I've kept hidden away. Because the worst part is this: the Tranquility is still operating, still taking passengers, still carrying a medical staff that I'm sure receives very specific instructions about what they're allowed to document and what they're required to conceal. And somewhere out there, passengers are boarding that ship for what they believe will be a relaxing vacation. And some of them will disembark with memories they don't remember creating. And the official record will explain it all in terms so rational and reasonable that nobody will think to question whether reality has become something other than what we've been told it is. I remember boarding. I remember the first night. And then I woke up in a hospital in Manila, 13 years later. But my body hadn't aged. My clothes were pristine, and my family said I'd been dead for 3 months. My name is Dante, and I don't exist in any way that makes logical sense. The official records say I died on October 18th, 2005. The death certificate was filed. My family held a memorial service. My belongings were distributed. My name was added to a list of victims from the Eternity disaster. And then, on January 7th, 2019, I woke up in a hospital in Manila with no memory of 13 years having passed. The Eternity was a luxury cruise ship operating in Southeast Asian waters. I was a 43-year-old businessman traveling alone. I'd booked the cruise as a means of escaping the pressures of my professional life. I was supposed to spend 2 weeks visiting ports in the Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand. I had no idea that those 2 weeks would become 13 years. I remember the evening of my first night aboard the Eternity. I had dinner in the main dining room, attended a show in the theater, and then returned to my cabin. I remember the cabin number 847. I remember the view from my window, the ocean at twilight, the last rays of sunlight reflecting off the water. I remember the sensation of the ship's gentle motion beneath me as I lay in bed, feeling that perfect combination of relaxation and anticipation that comes at the beginning of a vacation. And then nothing. No memories. No dreams that I can recall. No sense of time passing. Just blank darkness that felt like it lasted for seconds before I opened my eyes in a hospital room with fluorescent lights and the sound of machines monitoring my vital signs. The medical staff told me I was in Manila Medical Center. They told me I'd been found in a lifeboat approximately 30 kilometers off the coast of Mindanao. They told me I'd been unconscious when discovered. They told me I'd been brought to the hospital for evaluation and care. They told me the date, January 7th, 2019. I told them that was impossible. I told them I'd boarded the Eternity just the night before. I told them I didn't understand why I was in a hospital or why the date was 2019. I told them they must have made a mistake. The medical staff looked at each other with expressions I'd later learned to recognize as the look people give when they're about to deliver devastating information. The attending physician, a woman named Haley, pulled up a chair beside my bed and told me that according to their records, I had been missing for 13 years. According to the records, the Eternity had sunk on October 15th, 2005, 3 days after my embarkation. According to the records, all passengers and crew had been presumed lost. According to the records, I had been declared dead in absentia on October 18th, 2005. I thought they were joking. I thought this was some kind of elaborate prank. I laughed. I demanded they explain what was happening. I demanded they contact my family to confirm that this was all some kind of misunderstanding. But when Haley showed me a newspaper from January 2019, I stopped laughing. When she showed me photographs on the hospital computer showing world events from the past 13 years, I stopped demanding explanations. When she placed a mirror in front of my face, and I saw my reflection, unchanged, unaged, exactly as I remembered myself looking on the evening of October 14th, 2005. I stopped being able to process the information being presented to me. My body hadn't aged. My hair hadn't grayed. My skin hadn't wrinkled. My physical condition was consistent with a man who'd experienced 13 years of sleep rather than 13 years of life. But every external record, every official document, every piece of data in the hospital system indicated that 13 years had passed. The hospital ran extensive tests. They took blood samples. They performed imaging studies. They conducted neurological examinations. They interviewed me repeatedly, documenting my recollections, my memories, my understanding of what had happened to me. They documented everything in my medical file. Then, approximately 48 hours into my hospitalization, the tests began coming back with anomalies. My DNA initially didn't match the records on file. The DNA profile taken from my body didn't correspond to the profile that had been filed with the Maritime authorities when I boarded the Eternity in 2005. The hospital informed me that this was extremely unusual. DNA doesn't change. If the profiles didn't match, it suggested either that I wasn't the person identified on the Eternity passenger manifest, or that the original DNA sample had been compromised. But then they ran the test again, and the second time, my DNA matched perfectly. The system error was blamed on contamination in the initial sample. The second test confirmed my identity beyond question. My biometric data showed similar inconsistencies. My fingerprints didn't initially match the fingerprints on file. My iris patterns were flagged as anomalous. My facial recognition data triggered warnings in the system. And then, when the tests were repeated, everything matched perfectly. All the anomalies resolved. All the data aligned. It was as though my biometric identity had been uncertain for a brief moment before solidifying back into consistency. Haley documented all of this in my medical file. She noted the anomalies, the retesting, the eventual resolution. She noted her puzzlement about the inconsistencies. But she also noted that ultimately, my identity had been confirmed. I was Dante. I was the missing passenger from the Eternity. I had been gone for 13 years, and I had been found. They contacted my family. My sister, who'd been 9 years old when I disappeared, was now 22. My brother, who'd been 14, was now 27. My parents had aged 13 years. They had mourned me. They had accepted that I was dead. And then they received a phone call informing them that I was alive in a hospital in the Philippines, with no memory of the time that had passed. I don't remember much about that first phone call with my mother. I remember her voice on the line. I remember her crying. I remember her saying my name over and over, like she was confirming that I was actually there, that I was actually real, that the person on the other end of the line was actually her son. My parents flew to Manila. When they arrived at the hospital and saw me in person, I watched them struggle to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they believed they already knew. My father, a man I'd never seen express emotional vulnerability, broke down completely when he saw me. My mother held my hand and didn't let go for several hours. But as they spent time with me, I could see something changing in their expressions. They looked at me the way one might look at a ghost that's become partially solid. They looked at me like they were trying to confirm I was actually there. They looked at me with a combination of relief and profound unease. My mother asked me questions about my life before I boarded the Eternity. She asked me about my job, my apartment, my friends. I answered based on what I remembered from 2005. But as I spoke, I realized that I was describing a version of life that had been frozen in time for 13 years. I was talking about events and people and situations as though they still existed in the present, not realizing that everything had changed. The people I knew had aged. The companies I worked for had evolved or dissolved. The world had moved forward 13 years while I remained exactly as I'd been. My parents provided me with a smartphone. They showed me photographs. They showed me news articles about the years I'd lost. They tried to bring me current with 13 years of events. I saw the birth of my nieces. I saw the deaths of relatives I'd known. I saw the progression of historical events, political upheavals, technological developments, cultural shifts, all documented in photographs and videos and text. But none of it felt real. All of it felt like I was watching a film of someone else's life. Over the following weeks, as I remained in the hospital undergoing rehabilitation, I began to experience something that Haley eventually documented as severe dissociative episodes. I would remember events from 2019. I would know facts that had occurred during the 13-year period I'd supposedly missed. I would reference conversations I'd never had, because I hadn't been present for those conversations. I would demonstrate knowledge of people I'd never met, because I'd somehow absorbed information about them despite having no memory of the source of that information. I remember one specific incident. My brother mentioned a conversation he'd had with me about his medical school applications. I had never had that conversation with him. According to the timeline, I'd been missing when he applied to medical school. Yet I remembered the conversation in vivid detail. I remembered his anxiety about whether he'd get into his top choice program. I remembered his relief when his acceptance letter arrived. I remembered sitting with him while he read it. But I also knew, with absolute certainty, that I hadn't been there. The memories felt authentic, felt real, felt like they originated from my own consciousness. But they were memories of events I hadn't experienced. Haley documented this as a profound neurological anomaly. She consulted with colleagues. She conducted additional neuroimaging studies. She attempted to understand how I could possess memories of events that I had no logical way of experiencing. The most disturbing aspect was this. The knowledge I possessed about the 13-year period was incomplete and fragmented. I didn't remember everything. I had gaps. But what I did remember was often more detailed and more accurate than what my family described. I remembered specific words that had been spoken. I remembered the exact clothing people had been wearing. I remembered details that would have required direct observation, not second-hand description. When I finally left the hospital after 3 weeks of evaluation and rehabilitation, my family attempted to help me readjust to a world that had moved on without me. They took me to my parents' house. They showed me photographs and videos. They tried to help me understand who I'd become in the years I'd been missing. But I couldn't connect to any of it. I was frozen at age 43 in a world where everyone else was 13 years older. My friends, when I attempted to contact them, didn't know how to speak to me. The man they'd known had moved forward with his life, had aged, had changed. I was a living monument to the person he used to be. My professional life was gone. My career had progressed without me, or rather, had been terminated because I'd vanished. My apartment had been rented to someone else. My possessions had been distributed or discarded. I was a legal ghost, officially dead in some contexts, alive in others, fully existing in neither. Over the following years, I underwent extensive psychological treatment. I worked with therapists attempting to help me process the trauma of my disappearance and the disorientation of my reappearance. I took medications designed to manage the dissociative episodes. I participated in support groups with other survivors of trauma and displacement. But none of it helped me truly reconnect to the world. My family remained kind to me, but there was always a distance now. They loved me, but they couldn't quite accept that I was real in the way a person should be real. I was an anomaly. I was a disruption of the natural order of time. Then, approximately 5 years after my reappearance, I encountered something that changed everything. I was attending a survivor support group, not for my own condition, but out of a general sense that I needed to be around people who understood displacement and trauma. A woman at the group mentioned that she'd been aboard a cruise ship that had disappeared. The Eternity, she said. She'd boarded in 2005, experienced a single night aboard the ship, and then woken up in a hospital in 1998. I heard her incorrectly at first. I thought she'd said she woke up in 2018. But when I asked for clarification, she repeated it. 1998. She'd gone missing in 2005 and woken up in 1998. She'd experienced the opposite temporal displacement that I had experienced. She'd moved backward in time while I moved forward. She described her experience in fragmented sentences. She remembered boarding the Eternity. She remembered the first night. She remembered the ship's gentle motion. She remembered going to sleep. She remembered waking up in a hospital in 1998, 13 years before she'd boarded the ship, in a body that hadn't aged, in clothes that were pristine, with no memory of the time that supposedly hadn't passed yet. I asked her the ship's name again. She confirmed it, the Eternity. I asked her the approximate date of her disappearance. She said 2005. I asked her how many others had reported similar experiences from the same ship. She said she'd met 3 other people. All of them had boarded the Eternity. All of them had experienced a single night aboard the ship and then found themselves displaced in time. 1 of them had moved forward. 2 of them had moved backward. 1 of them, she said, couldn't quite explain their temporal displacement because they seemed to have moved forward and backward simultaneously. They woke up in a hospital in both 2015 and 1995, and they weren't sure which version of their timeline was real. I've spent the past 9 years since that group meeting attempting to locate the other survivors. I've been only partially successful. I've made contact with 2 of them. 1 confirmed a temporal displacement backward to 1998. The other confirmed forward displacement to 2019. Neither of them wanted to discuss the experience further. Both of them seemed profoundly unwell, not physically, but psychologically. Both of them exhibited the same dissociative symptoms that I experience. I believe that the Eternity was conducting something. Some kind of experiment or operation involving temporal displacement. I believe that the ship disappeared not because it sank, but because it moved to a different point in the temporal continuum. I believe that the passengers aboard experienced a single night, but that single night somehow became distributed across the timeline in ways that defy logical explanation. I believe that I'm not actually the man named Dante who boarded the Eternity in 2005. I believe that I'm some kind of temporal afterimage, a consciousness distributed across time in a way that human neurological systems aren't designed to process. I believe that I'm experiencing a version of reality that is fundamentally broken. And the worst part is that I can't share this belief with anyone who hasn't experienced the same thing. Mental health professionals see me as suffering from severe dissociative disorder. My family sees me as a trauma survivor, struggling to process an inexplicable event. The medical community sees me as an anomaly to be studied, but only if the anomaly remains contained and non-threatening. The truth, if there is a truth, remains locked inside my consciousness, inaccessible even to me. I exist in a state of permanent displacement. I am neither fully of 2005 nor fully of 2019. I am a man who has lived multiple timelines simultaneously, and I am not designed to survive in this state. The Eternity is still operating. I've confirmed this through careful research. It's still taking passengers. It's still conducting whatever operation it conducted on me. And somewhere out there, new passengers are experiencing that single night aboard the ship, unaware that they're about to have their entire understanding of reality shattered by displacement across the timeline. I document this account in the hope that someone will understand, in the hope that someone will investigate the Eternity, in the hope that someone will prevent others from experiencing what I've experienced. But I suspect that hope is futile, because the Eternity's operation isn't limited by time in the way normal operations are limited. By the time anyone investigates, The ship will have already conducted its experiment on 1,000 different timelines, across 1,000 different versions of 2005, 2019, and years that haven't happened yet. And I will remain here, frozen at the age of 43, waiting for a resolution that exists in none of the temporal coordinates I can access. Thank you for joining me on another journey into the darkness with Mr. Nightveil. These 10 cruise ship horror stories reveal the sinister truths hidden beneath the ocean's surface. Tales of time distortion, disappearances, and unthinkable experiments. If these narratives unsettled you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more chilling accounts. Share your own supernatural experiences in the comments. Stay vigilant. Stay skeptical. The sea keeps many secrets.